This story begins with a girl asking what was going on, questioning where they were and if they had gone to the wrong place. The other girl says they were in the right place, and finally they arrived at their destination, a planet called Earth. Sometime later, that irritated woman calls a boy whose name was Robert, accusing him of being a food thief. Meanwhile, a man was analyzing that planet surprised. The other girl, on her part, says that it was a planet with extreme radiation and not even a trace of oxygen, questioning whether there really was a gang of criminals there. Moreover, a high-ranking member of the Black Blood Gang could be there. Hearing what the girl had said, the young man seemed to confirm it. Noticing her bad mood, the boy replies that the information was leaked when someone named Moon hacked the main system on the beggar's sect. Then the woman asks the other girl, whose name was Sunja, what she thought about it. She responds that going to that place was the same as committing suicide. The oxygen saturation was 23%, along with a contamination level of 87%, which meant it was the perfect place to be killed. The other girl, in turn, asks if it was possible for a human being to survive in that place. She responds that with a first-grade radiation shield and an internal high-capacity energy reserve that could last for cycles, it might be possible. However, they could only last for 6 hours in total. Then the girl asks what they would do if they went and found nothing, and if it was worth risking their life. However, Robert was deep in thought about it because he would have to lose his life for nothing. The coordinates of their target were already located, and in the past, that place was called Mount Hua. Looking at that mountain, the girl wonders if that was the mountain she had heard so much about. Sunja, in turn, says yes, and it was the same place that the old men of the Martial Alliance call the legendary Sanctuary, and the origin of the star system was in that place. Looking around, the girl asks if, by chance, it was a junkyard, wondering why they didn't clean it up to make more money. However, Robert responds that they were just chatting and doing nothing because they didn't want to do anything that didn't make money. Observing the place carefully, that woman mentions that it was the location. However, she realizes there was nothing there, asking if, by chance, she was sure of the location. Then the girl responds that it was down below, wondering if, by chance, she should do it. Then Robert asks what the girl was planning to do. She replies that the Kirkus down below was probably still alive. Then a device on her waist seems to be activated. As a blue aura starts to come out, the girl responds that if it was buried so deep, it would have suffocated a long time ago, ordering the place to open, which is followed by an explosion. As a result, Robert ends up covered in dirt, asking to be warned next time. Looking below, the girl seems surprised as a huge hole had opened. Then the girl asks Sunja if there were any signs of life in that place. She responds that it was weak but still alive. Moreover, there was also a giant space below them. Then Robert asks to bring the electronic ladder. However, without even waiting, the girl jumps into the hole, leaving Robert confused by what he had seen. Sometime later, the two were already below that place, and in front of them was a giant door guarding that place. Looking at the writing, Robert wonders what it was. Then the other girl asks Sunja to translate all of it. Then the girl responds that it was an ancient language used about 2,000 years ago, and in real terms, it meant not to open it if they didn't want to die. Desperate, Robert says he had told them that Bastard was hiding in that place. The girl, in turn, asks if it was a threat in an ancient language no one understood. Then Robert responds that it could be possible. The girl responds that anyway, it could be a good sign, and if they were threatening them not to open it, there might be something valuable inside. Which immediately after, she opens the door, completely surprised by what they saw, for in front of them was a person waiting for them. Looking at that completely hairy man, Robert mentions that he seemed human, but even so, he was very different. Right after that, the girl starts climbing the ladder, approaching that unknown man. Robert, who is still in the background, seemingly scared, asks the girl if he was alive and if, by chance, he was some kind of human. Observing the young man, the girl remains silent. Then she touches the boy. However, she becomes confused, because at that very moment, a purple energy began to emanate between her fingers. And immediately after, that man seems to awaken. Apparently trying to protect herself, the girl asks what that was. Then an explosion happens, and that beam was so strong that it reached the top of that place, managing to even pierce the orbit of the planet. Surprised, Sunja asks what was happening, and if, by any chance, they had done something. However, the two simply weren't answering her questions. Meanwhile, below, a huge cloud of smoke surrounded the area, and that girl, apparently injured, was on the ground. In front of her, Robert seemed to be unconscious. Then the woman becomes surprised, because that hairy man was standing right in front of her, asking who she was, and what had made her dare to awaken him. However, observing the man, the girl remains silent, wondering if it was a challenge, and if finally a martial artist had been born capable of challenging her. Then the man asks the girl again to say something, questioning why she had woken him. However, the woman asks what he was talking about, since she couldn't understand a word. She takes her device to translate the voice in real time. It seemed like she was starting to cast a spell. The man says that if she didn't answer, he might kill her. Quickly, the girl stands up, preparing another spell, wondering what kind of monster he was. Then she starts launching a series of attacks at the man, which in consequence leaves her exhausted. However, the man did not suffer any effect from the attack. Then the man begins to say that the divine art of Kumi and the divine palm of the red mist, although they were martial arts from Ame, they represent many impurities, suggesting that they were learned through theft. In other words, that girl was just a thief, who made her living by robbing other people's tombs. Then a man stands over her, saying that, as a mere thief, she could not disturb his eternal rest, and because she had done that, the girl was going to die. But at that moment, the woman seems confused, because that man collapsed on the ground like dead weight. Confused, the girl wonders what was happening. Then Robert responds that he might have been killed, because he had been exposed to that radiation without any protection, and for that reason, it was natural for him to die. But even so, that man resisted for a long time. However, Sunja responds that he was still alive and his breathing and pulse were normal. It seemed he had collapsed due to energy exhaustion. His body was fine, but the battery inside his stomach was completely drained. Then they all assumed that the man had probably fainted from hunger. Sometime later, inside the ship, Robert seems extremely irritated, asking why they had brought the man, saying they should have left him there, asking if she hadn't seen him go crazy earlier because he was worse than they had imagined. Besides, there would be no benefit in bringing that man to their ship. But the girl responds that they could probably sell him for money, leaving the two completely shocked by what they had heard. Then the girl asks them what the most valuable cultural heritage was at the moment. Sunja responds that it was ancient martial arts, and the closer to the original, the more expensive. And judging by the circumstances, that ball of hair was probably an ancient martial artist from at least 2,000 years ago. And that era was a legendary period when martial arts were extremely developed. Even the lowest class F techniques from that time were worth at least 10,000 yuan. But that man was not just anyone and must have been an incomparable grandmaster. Robert in turn says that if he was really of rank S, then they had hit the jackpot, asking what might happen if he woke up. The girl tells him not to worry because he was bound the celestial silk thread used to repair paranevs, and not even the head of the Sholin sect could cut it. But at that moment, the man was already standing without any of those bindings, asking how those tomb robbers dared to desecrate him, and for that, he would tear them to pieces. Desperate, Robert says he knew this was going to happen. However, the two become surprised, because Sunja was simply below him, handing him some food. Then the man immediately begins to eat. Sometime later, that unknown man was still sitting at a table eating. The other girl, in turn, asks Sunja how she knew about that. Sunja responds that the man seemed to have been starving for a long time. That's why the best thing for a hungry animal was a sausage. Sometime later, the man had already finished eating, asking if they weren't tomb raiders, but rather bounty hunters who accidentally woke him up. Besides, this world was 2,000 years ahead of his time. And the girl responds that a year after harming each other, they ended up having a horrible end. As a consequence, they decided to live in the skies. Thus, things stabilized since then, and they decided to ban all weapons, including martial arts and nuclear weapons. The man, in turn, asks what the current era was called. Then the girl responds that it was the year 1105 of the galactic calendar. The man asks again if she lived in the sky. The girl, in turn, asks if he was starting to wake up, saying that's right because after waking up after 2,000 years, he should be immensely grateful. Irritated, the man says it was absurd, asking who they thought they were talking to and if they knew who he was, saying they were nothing more than third-rate tomb robbers and now tried to deceive him with their nonsense. At that moment, the three point to one side. Then the man seems to start observing something, and realizes that he was above that planet. The girl responds that was where the young man was. As he observes the planet, the man asks if that was the world he lived in before. The girl, replying yes, mentions that now it was completely destroyed, asking if he believed the three of them now. Irritated, the man says that even if he wanted to believe, he couldn't, questioning if they expected him to believe that the earth he walked on was round. Then Robert seems to notice something, because that man emitted a terrible smell. The girl responds that he was going to take care of the rest later, asking if maybe he should take a bath and cut his hair. Sometime later, that man seems to have already bathed. Robert, in turn, asks why he didn't leave his hair as it was, because he feared that person might end up looking like a mummy coming out of there. However, the three are surprised by what they saw, because a very handsome boy was under all that hair. Then the boy asks what they had been eating earlier. Observing the man's beauty, the girl is surprised, asking who he was. Sometime later, that ship was still flying through space, and the boy, surprised, says that was the sky after all. Once he lamented how small his world was, but that was really a strange sight. Then the girl pinches the other man, asking how old he really was since hibernation years didn't count. Meanwhile, Robert and Sunja observed that boy, mentioning that he was completely abnormal. Sometime later, that spaceship seems to have arrived at its destination. Sunja, observing it, seems surprised, because that boy was eating a lot, mentioning that the boy had been starving for 2,000 years. Meanwhile, a man asks why they were looking for a broker. That girl from before says it had to be someone rich and tough because it was really expensive and valuable. Surprised, the man asks how valuable it had to be for the flaming demon to be so anxious. The girl, in turn, asked how much a complete collection of martial arts manuscripts from 2,000 years ago would be worth, and if they were all originals, especially of rank S. leaving the man completely shocked by what he had heard. The other man says that if they were real and of rank S from 2,000 years ago, they would be incredibly valuable. Then the man says it would be worth 0 credits, because if such things existed, a single book could buy a planet or more, asking if she claimed to have found a bunch of them, and the flaming demon was just a mere mid-level hunter. Sometime later, the girl had already left that place, asking Robert where Sum was, who responds that he went to buy supplies, questioning how the conversation had gone. The woman responds that it went very well, mentioning that he would enter into a contract with them as soon as someone bought it. However, she wanted to know something, asking what the protagonist was doing. Then Robert responds that the boy had finally stopped eating. Right after that, the door to that place opens, and everyone around begins to observe the 2 people who entered the room. Then a group of people starts walking around that place. Observing everyone, the woman is surprised, wondering if they were from the Celestial Demon sect. Robert says that's right, and that person was from the Red Wolf squad, mentioning that if they were really from there, they were probably inspectors from the demon sect, questioning why they were there. Then the girl mentions that they specialized in tracking, so they must be after someone. Immediately after, the protagonist seems to overhear the conversation, asking if she was referring to the Celestial Demon sect. The woman then asks how he knew about them, even though he had been asleep for 2,000 years, questioning if they already existed in his time. The protagonist asks why people weren't fleeing, because if they were really members of that sect, they should at least be in a panic. The girl asks why they should do that, saying the sect had its peculiarities, but they still prided themselves on being the most important sect in the entire universe, leaving the boy completely surprised by what he had heard, thinking that his dream, which always seemed distant and so empty, could actually become a reality. Meanwhile, that man with a piercing gaze was walking through the restaurant and people around began to observe. However, the man was apparently hiding his face for some reason. Then that man, approaching the other guy, asks him to look at him. Right after that, the man seems to analyze the statistics of that man, stating that today was his lucky day because he was not his target. Therefore, he should burn the Martial Alliance now and surrender, because if he didn't, terrible things could happen to him. At that moment, the man seems confused as a hand was placed on his head, and that hand belonged to our protagonist, saying that it was admirable because his dream, which seemed impossible, had finally come true. And for that reason, it was amazing, mentioning that they must have gone through a lot of suffering to reach that level. Meanwhile, the man asks if the boy had mental problems. Robert, trying to interfere, says the boy didn't exactly have mental issues, but rather that his social skills were a bit weak. Then the man mentions that today was the protagonist's lucky day, because if he had felt a single thread of martial arts on his body, he would already be in pieces. However, when he tries to push the protagonist off of him, he becomes confused as the boy didn't move an inch. Robert, in turn, wonders what was happening. Meanwhile, that man was still determined to remove the protagonist from him. Then the system alerts that internal energy activation had been triggered and the Blood Wolf Demon art was at its maximum level. Immediately after, a purple aura begins to envelop the man, telling him to stop playing. Then a gigantic wind circle starts surrounding the area, and everyone around was completely surprised, wondering what could be happening. Immediately after, the man seems confused. The other girl, in turn, asks if he might be in his worst shape. Totally confused, the man asks who the protagonist was, wondering how that was possible because he was about to kill him. While observing the protagonist's statistics, the system alerts that nothing was confirmed, leaving the man completely shocked, asking how a natural being with 0 internal energy could still be alive. The boy starts speaking, saying that the Shadow Demon art was one of the lowest level martial arts among the Celestial Demon body arts, but even so, it was admirable that it had been passed down until now. However, it was a shame that his internal energy wasn't in harmony, as it seemed that his training method was still flawed. For that reason, meeting the boy was a life opportunity, saying that he would correct the man. However, the man didn't want any conversation, starting to launch an attack at the boy, but the young man easily dodges it. Thus, the man begins to launch several sequences of attacks, which the protagonist easily dodges. Park, in turn, thinks that the energy was sufficient and the forms were precise. However, all that still wasn't enough. Immediately after, the protagonist seems to get irritated, asking them to stop the fight. While throwing the man to the ground, the boy says that it was very unpleasant, that everyone around was completely surprised by what the boy had done because that bully was simply lying on the ground, unconscious. The boy, in turn, says that the man had learned well, but had learned like a parrot, because martial arts were not just about imitation, but about adapting and making them your own. For that reason, if he had already understood everything, he should get up immediately. Observing the situation, the other man's henchmen seemed confused, starting to advance toward the protagonist, asking how he dared to confront the leader of their squad. Immediately after, they draw their weapons. Then the scene cuts to the Celestial Demon sect in District 32. And meanwhile, in front of a screen, an unknown man was analyzing the battle the protagonist was involved in. The man, who was the commander of District 32, mentions that it was unbelievable. Then an elder in the background says that fortunately there were only a few serious injuries and their lives were not in danger. The man, starting to speak, asks if that was really a good thing because an unknown boy had left his squad in that state, asking if he had said the boy wasn't registered in the Martial Alliance database. The man responds that yes, but his companions were registered and their group was known as a bounty hunters guild called the S-Demons. They captured Class B criminals and other lower-class offenders led by a woman named Sirion, the Flaming Demon. Meanwhile, our protagonist was in that same ship as before, apparently waiting for some food, while Sirion and Robert were watching him. Back in the previous location, the scientist confirms that the girl was known for being a bounty hunter in the Orthodox world, and after the incident, they left the Wild Crane Inn, but they could track them, asking if they should send a pursuit team. However, the man says no, mentioning that he would handle it personally. Observing his leader, the scientist remains silent, seemingly agreeing with his orders. Then immediately after, the man presses a button and a person appears, mentioning that it had been a long time, asking if there was any request. Returning to the protagonist, the young man was still waiting for his food. Robert asks his captain to be honest, questioning if she was as scared as he was. However, Sirion questions what he was talking about. Robert asks if she hadn't seen what had happened, as the Red Wolf squad of rank A martial artists had been defeated with just one blow because of the protagonist. However, the girl says that if she had fought them, she could have also won because they were just weak rank A people. Robert, in turn, says that even if he used all his power, he could only scratch them a little. However, for that man, it had been like killing flies, which is why the protagonist was so incredible. Immediately after, Sirion approaches the protagonist, saying they should talk for a bit, but the boy says he wants food first. Sitting down, the girl asks what his name was. Robert asks her to be a bit more formal when speaking to the boy. Immediately after, Sunja brings more food for the boy. However, Sirion asks not to give it to him yet because they hadn't finished talking, asking what the young man's name was. Robert, in turn, says that you shouldn't bother even a dog when it's eating, so they should at least let him eat first. At that moment, the protagonist reveals that his name was Lee Mokijin. Then Sirion asks what his identity was and what his profession was. However, the young man seems to remain silent, responding that he was a supreme celestial demon. Sirion is completely shocked by what she heard, asking what kind of nonsense that was and if the sausages had done something bad to him. Immediately after, everything around turns red. Then Sunja warns that a target had been detected and they were being tracked, so they were already close. Sirion says she knew that because it was probably the celestial demon sect, as after defeating the Red Wolf squad, it wouldn't leave them in peace. However, Sunja responds that it wasn't that sect, but rather a group called Greenwood. A man, passing on the location to someone, responds that the Demon-esque ship had been confirmed, and it was their target. Then, the leader of the Galactic Division was closely observing the situation. Another commander, approaching the man, asks if they should fire an EMP capture bomb. The man asks if they had said they were bounty hunters. Responding yes, the other man informs him that according to their investigations, they mainly operated in the peripheral regions of the galaxy, and their leader was someone nicknamed the Flaming Demon. Surprised, the man wonders why the Celestial sect was concerned with such a small group. Remembering a flashback from his past, he says that he accepted the mission, and they should be informed of the completion conditions, asking what they should do when they captured the target. Then the other man says there was no need to capture them, as they should simply erase them from existence, leaving the man completely shocked by what he had heard. Returning to the present, he says that something about that was very strange, because there was definitely something going on behind the scenes, as that group was much more skilled at taking lives than they were. For that reason, there must be some reason for them to assign this task to them, and something must be inside that ship. Observing from below, the girl says they brought an entire crowd with them, mentioning that they were probably bandits, there to rob them. However, Robert responds that he doubted that asking what profit they would have by bringing such a large group to rob people like them. Sirion agrees with his point of view, though the way he said it bothered her. But regardless, it didn't matter, because if those thieves got in their way, they would probably die. However, Sunja responds that it wasn't that simple, as they were part of the Galactic Division of Greenwood's 72 fortresses, and it seemed the entire division had been mobilized. Then Sirion says that meant the division leader was also there. Meanwhile, the protagonist seeking content, analyzing everything and thinking it was all very cool. Back to Sirion, she responds that even she wouldn't be able to defeat that guy so easily. Robert in turn replies that of course it wasn't easy. She would be dead in 3 moves if she fought him. Then the girl responds that she wasn't that weak, and if she really went all out, she could probably win. However, Robert says they should just surrender because they had nothing to lose and shouldn't fear anything. Then Sirion tells them to follow her orders from now on, and first they would fire EMP capture bombs to cut the ship's power and incapacitate them. For that reason, she would let it happen so that they could board the ship armed, and because of that, she would allow it. Furthermore, they would let them search the ship and give them everything they wanted for their survival. Robert, in turn, asks what the difference was between that and surrendering, but the girl tells him to just follow her orders. Approaching the protagonist, the girl asks him not to panic because when the EMP hit the ship, it would shake a little. However, he shouldn't worry as there was no destructive deal in place, and due to space laws, those guys couldn't use the ship's weapons. And if he understood, he shouldn't interfere in anything because once they got what they wanted, they would leave them in peace. but if a fight broke out and things got worse, she couldn't guarantee anything. Immediately after, a warning is issued for everyone to prepare for the impact. Then Sunja, completely surprised, mentions that it was a photon cannon. That ship had a photon destroyer cannon, and for that reason, they were probably trying to kill him. Inside the other ship, the man responds that it violated space norms, and for that reason, it could cause problems later, and capturing them quietly would be much better. However, the man says he had a bad feeling, so they should just reduce them to dust and not complicate things, as they could transfer all the responsibility to the client, ordering them to fire when ready. Back on the protagonist's ship, Seryong asks if they should evade. However, Sunja responds that they were surrounded on all sides. Additionally, none of their shields were functioning. Observing the situation, the girl asks what they should do now. Immediately after, that man announces that the cannon was fully charged. At that moment, the man orders them to fire. Then the beam is fired toward the protagonist. As a result, an explosion occurs. However, the man seems surprised because the ship had managed to escape without any damage, and above it, an unknown person was interfering in the battle. Desperate, the girl wonders what that was. Then the man above the ship seems to recognize the woman, mentioning that her name was Helena. Meanwhile, the protagonist and his group were analyzing everything that was happening above, and that man, in turn, asks why that woman was there. Meanwhile, with a piercing gaze, she was observing the man. The other guy says that was a terraforming grade shield, so they could penetrate it and maximize the photon cannon's power, asking if they should recharge. Then the man asks if they were about to start a space war just to deal with the bug, and says that person wasn't easy to handle. For that reason, they should activate the teleportation immediately. As he was leaving, he wonders why that monster was there. Robert says that was the 8-foot ghost, a rank as bounty hunter, so unpredictable that even the leaders of most sects fear her. Seryong, in turn, says the most intriguing thing was figuring out why she saved them, because if she hadn't blocked the photon cannon, they would probably have been dead already. Immediately after, the man teleports in front of the woman, mentioning that it had been a long time since they had met. However, the girl remains silent. The man, in turn, asked if she hadn't forgotten about him, mentioning that he was the 55th younger brother named Kim, who had greeted her at his mother's birthday 2 years ago. However, the girl didn't want to hear any of it, telling him to leave. But the man insists on formally introducing himself, this time not as Kim, but as the leader of the Galactic Division of Greenwood's 72 fortresses. So telling him to leave was the same as telling everyone in that place to retreat, and for that reason, he wouldn't accept it. Immediately after, the girl seems to get irritated. Robert, observing the situation in the background, assumes they were probably about to fight, and the other girl responds that it wouldn't be easy because, even for Greenwood, that woman was not weak at all. Dealing with Helena was difficult, and if they were unlucky, her mother could show up at the worst possible time. However, Robert, confused, asks what she meant by that. The other man, in turn, says she was the same as always, resorting to fists instead of mere conversation. But in any case, he gave up on the matter because he didn't want to fight, thinking that this battle was a waste of time, especially for such an absurd job as this, saying they would resolve it peacefully, but wanted to know why she was interfering, asking if by chance they were her targets, because if that was the case, they wouldn't interfere anyway. However, the woman, without any ceremony, simply tells them to leave. Observing the situation, the man thinks that was to be expected, wondering why that girl was after such insignificant people. Immediately after, that woman sends a message, saying to hand her over or everyone would die. Seryong, inside the ship, asks what was happening. Robert, desperate, asks what she wanted from them, wondering if they really had something valuable, questioning if by chance their captain had hidden something from them without telling them, because there was nothing that could attract a rank as bounty hunter like her. However, Seryong attentively observes the protagonist, asking if he knew that woman, as maybe they had a history, or if they had dated and then broken up. However, the protagonist responds that it wasn't because of him, replying that it was probably because of that child. But when they look back, they don't see anything. Seryong, in turn, asks what he was talking about. Then the protagonist asks the girl to appear because there was nothing to fear. At that moment, a silhouette begins to appear, and a girl emerges. Surprised, Seryong asks how she had gotten in there. The boy responds that she had followed them since the inn. She had presence but no form, which is why she hadn't done anything. Moreover, it was a stealth technique that even hid her breathing, and it seemed martial arts had developed in that time. However, Sunja responds that it wasn't a stealth technique, but rather that she was using one of her rings, and that was quantum technology, an extremely expensive item. Approaching the girl, Seryong asks what her intention was and why she had sneakily entered her ship. Stammering, the girl responds that her name was Hua Hin, but the irritated woman asks who had asked for her name, asking if she was after them and if, by chance, they were her target. The girl responds that it was probably the case because as long as she was alive, they wouldn't stop. Immediately after, Robert asks if her name was really Hin, and Seryong questions if the man knew that girl. Robert, surprised, asks if she didn't know the girl as she was the lead vocalist of Pronuncium. However, Seryong seems to understand none of that. Robert responds that she was part of the best rookie idol duo in the galaxy, and she should know that. because that was the lead vocalist of the idol group that enchanted them with that hit song she listened to all the time, mentioning that he was sure of it, affirming that she was even more beautiful in person. Meanwhile, he pulls out his phone to analyze the photo to confirm if it was really the girl. At that moment, Helena, above the base, announces that it was her last warning, as they had 10 minutes to hand over that girl, and if that didn't happen, everyone would die. Robert, in turn, asks the girl why she was doing that and what her reason could be. However, Seryang responds that it didn't make a difference, mentioning that she was an intruder, and for that reason, it had nothing to do with them, so she should just leave immediately. Robert, in turn, tries to interfere in the situation, attempting to convince her to change her mind. However, Seryang had already made her decision. Even so, Robert insists that it wasn't right because she was the lead vocalist of Pronuncium. The girl responds that they couldn't protect her anyway since they were fighting against Greenwood, and for that reason, there was no way to go against Helena, the 8-foot demon. Even if they tried to protect her, her fate wouldn't change, but theirs would, as they could all end up dying. Even so, she didn't like the situation. Then the girl starts opening the gate. However, the protagonist intervenes, asking her if she hadn't told them not to worry. Robert, surprised, asks when the protagonist had entered that area. Immediately after, Seryang orders to close the gate immediately. But Robert insists on waiting to see what happens, as that man was extremely strong and might even defeat Helena. However, for Seryang, that was impossible, as they were still in outer space. She asks Sunja to close the gate right away. However, Sunja responds that it's too late because the two had already exited the spacecraft. Seryang, completely surprised, says that boy was crazy for really having gone outside. Outside the spacecraft, the girl remains silent, thanking him for his help but warning that they were very strong martial artists, and for that reason, he should be careful. However, when she looks at him, she notices his eyes were all red. The girl asks why he hadn't entered a shield. Immediately after, the young man seems to try to return to the spacecraft. The girl is completely shocked because the protagonist had really gone outside the spacecraft without any protection. Meanwhile, Helena and the man were observing the situation, saying that the external temperature was minus 300 degrees and the pressure would make his internal organs explode in 10 seconds, questioning why he had left without any protective shield. Immediately after, the boy seems to be in agony from the pain. Then Seryang intervenes, managing to activate the shield on the protagonist. Desperate, the girl asks Lee to wake up immediately. However, the boy asks what she was doing, and when she looks at him, he was completely calm. Irritated, the girl mentions that she thought the boy was dead. Lee responds that she was worrying for no reason, as he was the supreme leader of heaven and earth, and nothing in this world could threaten his life. He then asks how to take down from there. Robert, relieved, realizes the girl had arrived in time. However, Sunja replies that she had arrived quite late and even the master couldn't survive in space without a shield for more than a minute. However, our protagonist had endured 6 minutes and 13 seconds and on top of that, hadn't suffered any damage. For this reason, he had far exceeded human limits. Meanwhile, the protagonist was observing the girl. Seryang thinks she had heard that woman was a maniac for fights and her aura wasn't a joke. Moreover, Kim from Greenwood was also present in that location. She asked not to cause any problems, saying she would take care of it, and for that reason, he shouldn't interfere. Changing her expression, the girl says that nothing bad had happened, questioning if he had stayed as healthy as always. She mentions that she had heard more about them and seeing them in person was even better. Observing the situation, the two remain silent. Immediately after, the little girl seems to grab the protagonist's hand, apparently in desperation. Lee, in turn, says she doesn't need to be nervous because he was by her side. However, the girl responds that the woman wasn't human but a ghost with a fighting spirit. She explains that since she was young, she had traveled the world in search of opponents, and no one had survived a fight with that woman until now. Lee, in turn, says the child was extraordinary, a young girl who had dedicated her heart and soul to martial training and had a rare talent indeed. However, the girl says it wasn't just that. Seryang, in turn, says that whatever the case, as companions of the Central Plains, they should talk peacefully. However, the woman responds that she talks with her sword. Immediately, she rushes toward the girl, delivering an attack that the girl narrowly dodges. The girl asks what she was doing as she had said to talk and questions why she was swinging her weapon out of nowhere. The man observing the situation thinks that wasn't bad at all, because even though it wasn't at full power, it wasn't an easy attack to dodge. Immediately after, the woman advances again towards Seryang, and the man thinks the girl would die a painful death. However, he swallows his words. Meanwhile, the protagonist is still consoling the girl, asking if she was afraid of that because it was just child's play, mentioning that it seemed grandiose but was really just a meaningless noise, and if she was scared by the sound of it, there was nothing to worry about. He asked the girl to calmly control her breathing so she could relax. At that moment, the protagonist intervenes in the situation, saying that if there was anything to discuss with that child, it should be said to him. The other man, while analyzing the protagonist's stats, is informed by the system that nothing had been identified. Completely shocked by what he saw, he assumes the boy was an unnamed natural from the outskirts. Then Lai responds that if there was nothing to say, they should leave immediately. But within seconds, a sudden explosion occurs. It was Helena charging at the protagonist, but he easily blocks her attack. The man is left completely stunned, wondering how he could do that without any internal energy. Lai responds that something felt strange, as using the radiant sword technique from the Yang Kang sect with his spear was one thing, but channeling the great divine art of Abraham from Shaolin to gain internal energy was another. Moreover, the girl was young but had internal energy that surpassed her age, and for that reason, she had probably encountered some sort of good fortune. Immediately after, Helena seems to increase the force of her attack, but even then, nothing she does seems to have an effect. The other man, observing the situation, asks if Helena had been this strong from the beginning. However, for Lai, it was nothing, questioning if that was really all of her power. Then a flashback from the girl's life appears, with a voice saying that if she wanted to go out into the world, it wouldn't stop her. Any fight that improved her training was allowed, but death was not. Helena had become strong, and there were fewer than 10 martial artists in the world who could harm her. But even then, none of them could easily kill her. Even so, she should never forget that she was her mother's daughter. Therefore, there was one rule. If the ring chimed, she had to flee no matter what happened. Because when that happened, it meant her opponent was beyond her reach. If she ignored that warning, she would surely die. Returning to the present, the girl stared intensely at the protagonist, and a voice in her head asks why she was hesitating, telling her to flee at once. Another flashback from her life appears, with a voice telling her to greet them as those were her siblings. They all had different fathers, but they were all born from her mother, and since they shared blood, they should stay close to one another, asking what her real name was. Meanwhile, back in the present, the girl's power level exceeded 100%, and the protagonist, observing the situation, remained silent. Immediately after, the girl seems to change her form. Lai responds that she had extraordinary talent because gaining respect wasn't easy. However, all of this was still a bit excessive. He easily dodges her attacks, and with each passing second, her power level continued to rise. However, Lai had already grown tired of the game. He managed to counter the attack with just one strike. An explosion occurs as a result. Everyone around seemed very surprised because Helena had transformed once again. She begins to charge at the protagonist once more, but with a threatening look, he orders her to stop at once, mentioning that her talent was admirable, but all of this had gone too far. Her awakening revealed wounds and desires, and she was being consumed by herself. As an exchange, he would resolve it, but if she continued in the same way, he would have no choice but to kill her to stop her, because he had promised to protect that child earlier. At that moment, the girl attempts to strike the protagonist again. Apparently irritated, he asks her to stop one last time. A collision of the two attacks occurs, causing the ship to break apart. As a result, an explosion happens. Above that other location, the man was observing everything when his chief suddenly appears, seemingly very injured. He says that if the teleportation had been delayed just a little longer, he would have been torn to pieces. He couldn't believe the immense explosion that had just occurred. Sirion, on the other hand, asks if they were crazy because they had nearly killed everyone. Even in the past, she questions who sets fire to their own ship in the middle of the ocean just because they're angry, mentioning that they must have gotten confused. However, for the protagonist, holding back was not an option. Immediately after, the girl asks if he was hurt. Then Lai reveals that her power was much greater than he had imagined. As he looked up, he saw the girl crying in the vastness of space. Then Sirion asked if the girl was dead. Li revealed that she was still alive because a greater force had protected her. Immediately after, a hooded woman appeared, picking up the girl in her arms. She quickly left. The girl thought to herself that this must be the matron of the Eastern Sky Sword. At the same moment, a giant ship appeared. Li coldly observed the situation. Sometime later, that same girl from before was apparently inside a tube filled with water, and a woman was watching her. Behind her stood the other man from earlier, along with the protagonist and his group facing the woman. The man, addressing the woman as mother, says that he didn't know she would come to that place and asks to be punished for his lack of loyalty and devotion. However, the woman simply asks him not to interfere in the matter, telling him to act as if he wasn't there. Introducing herself to Li, the woman reveals that she is the matriarch of the Eastern Sky Sword. The other man is shocked because his mother is showing respect. The other girl is also surprised by what she witnessed. Continuing to speak, the woman admits that for personal reasons, she broke the martial arts dual code by intervening in a reckless fight. She offers to cut off her arm as an apology if necessary. However, the protagonist says that such measures weren't needed and asks if that girl was her daughter. Immediately, Sirion interjects, saying that they were speaking with the matriarch of the Eastern Sky Sword and therefore he should be more careful with his words. The woman then confirms that the girl was indeed her daughter, stating that her family prioritized the dual code above all else. Sirion asks him to be respectful in his speech as that woman was one of the 5 immortals and the matriarch of the Western Sky Sword. Her temper was so fierce that she could split the protagonist in two with just a glance. However, at that moment, the lady bows slightly, explaining that although her daughter hasn't yet woken up, it was confirmed that she had passed through Mount Hua shortly before. Therefore, it was likely that she had been contaminated in that place. Yet, the martial arts the master displayed a while ago seemed to be the Sura Demon Heart Sword technique. She asked if she could know whether he had any connection to the Celestial Demon sect. The protagonist in turn says he wasn't aware of that, mentioning that in the past he had a deep connection, a time had passed. He states that time corrodes even the strongest bonds as if they were made of iron, dissolving the deepest connections, even those stronger than life itself. As she observes, the girl thinks that he was truly an extraordinary figure. Everything about him was perfectly refined with no trace of artificiality, supposing that such a state could only be achieved during the pinnacle of martial arts mastery. She mentions that the young man seemed to be only around 20 years old, wondering if it could be due to some rejuvenation potion. Then the girl asks if she could request something from him. Immediately, the protagonist asks if she wanted him to fight her. He mentions that even though she was polite, every word she said was filled with killing intent like a sword being sharpened. He says he has never refused a challenge, but she should know that when they fought, one of them would surely die, and whoever survived would be gravely injured. The stronger the steel, the easier it breaks. The girl seemingly accepts the challenge. Meanwhile, Serion, observing from below the ship, notices the light. Back to the scene, the boy asks if they had any real reason to fight. He states that if they did, they should leave it for the future, as he wanted to experience more of the world. At that moment, the girl seems to reconsider. Sometime later, the ship departs from that location. After a while, the woman asks if it was a request from the celestial demon sect to silence him. The man confirms that was indeed the case. However, the lady says she didn't understand why, as the boy clearly possessed the supreme martial arts of the celestial demon sect. She questions why they wanted him dead. The man says there were recent reports that the celestial demon sect's Red Wolf squad had been annihilated by an unknown individual, supposing they might be related. However, the woman says that it didn't matter, because regardless of the situation, he wouldn't be able to deduce what had really happened. Therefore, he should just meticulously track his movements and report back to her. She asks if he could at least do that. The man replies that those from Greenwood prided themselves on being the best trackers in the world. Immediately, the woman says she will trust him again, asking him to track them without interfering in anything, because she didn't want her son to get hurt. She suddenly seems to remember something, asking what the young man's name was again. Sometime later, inside the ship, Serion asks the protagonist what kind of trouble he had gotten into again, asking what he had done to get involved with Grimwood or with Helena, the 8-foot ghost, and even more, the matron of the Eastern Sky Sword. Then the other girl says she really didn't know what happened, apologizing. She explains that after finishing her tour, she returned to her home, her homeland, and after that, everything was completely different. They were clearly the same people, but they were trying to kill them anyway. Meanwhile, the protagonist didn't seem to care much about the conversation, starting to eat right away. Serion replies that she has no idea what the girl is talking about, asking Sunja if she knew anything. Sunja responds that she doesn't either. However, Robert becomes surprised, asking if the girl mentioned something about Mount Hua, noting that it was also his homeland. He asks what had happened and urges her to speak immediately. Back in the capsule from earlier, Helena appears to break out of the capsule. Her mother asks her to explain what happened at Mount Hua. Then the scene cuts to a place called the Wild Crane Inn. Meanwhile, a man is observing a flashback of all the moves from the protagonist's fight against the other woman, recalling Serion's words, asking how much a complete collection of 2,000-year-old martial arts manuscripts would be worth. He is completely shocked because everything the girl had said was true, and it was probably a gigantic fortune. Then the scene cuts to the celestial demon sect. Commander Zhang is surprised, watching the protagonist's entire battle with that woman. The other man asks what he thinks because it was a very familiar martial art. Then it's revealed that the woman from earlier was apparently Halima's mother. The man recognizes that it was a level of martial arts proficiency he had never seen or heard of before, but doesn't understand what is meant by familiar. As he watches the man, the woman thinks he really doesn't know anything, asking why he went after that person, especially through Greenwood. The man responds that it's an internal matter of his sect, mentioning that she is the matron and ruler of the cosmic zone of the Western Sky Sword, and it's not something she should worry about. Immediately after, the woman draws her sword, and within seconds, she manages to make a cut on the man's throat. She asks if she was declaring war on the celestial demon sect. Then the woman asks if he thinks she of all people would fear a bloodbath. Observing the lady, the man thinks she is a woman driven by her obsession with martial arts, and because of that, she doesn't act based on profit or loss. At that moment, the girl starts using her abilities, demanding a response or he would die at once. The man asks if it isn't an obvious choice, saying that out of all the martial artists in District 32, they would stand no chance against the matron of the Western Sky Sword. Then the man tells her to get on with it because if she wanted to cut them all down, she should hurry up. Meanwhile, the woman thinks that people say those from the demon sect grow stronger every day, supposing that it was the Asura demon heart sword technique. However, the man asks what she means by that. Then the girl responds that the technique the protagonist had used was the Asura demon heart sword technique, a martial art of the celestial demon sect. The man says that's not possible, as that technique was a martial art that was lost thousands of years ago and only remains in legend. No one from his sect had ever practiced it. The woman says that it's not her problem if he doesn't know the martial arts of his own sect, affirming that she already told him what she knew and asked him again, questioning why they were chasing him. However, the man responds that it wasn't him they were after, saying they were pursuing the other girl. Sometime later, the protagonist seems to have arrived at Mount Hua. The place was truly beautiful, apparently with Chinese-style architecture. Inside the ship, Seryung asks why there was no one there, wondering if it was a holiday. Then Robert responds that it probably wasn't a holiday since the shops were open. Sunja warns that the city had more than 10,000 inhabitants, but there was no sign of life. Robert, in a panic, says that something must have happened, asking them to descend quickly because something terrible had occurred. He asserts that this was his hometown, and for that reason, they should save the city. Meanwhile, the girl, with tears in her eyes, watches the situation unfold. Immediately after, she asks him if something had happened, saying that if he knew anything, he should tell them right away. At that moment, Sunja mentions that she had detected a life signal, and judging by its location, it was inside the main headquarters of the place. Seryung then asks if that's where the leader of the Mount sect lived. Sunja confirms, saying it was a very strong signal, but from only one person. Sometime later, the group seems to have arrived at their destination. Robert, standing beside them, was equipped with a monstrous suit of armor, saying that whoever had done this to his hometown would not be forgiven. Seryung asks if his combat suit was still functional, questioning if he hadn't stored it in the depot after being discharged. Immediately after, she asks Sunja about the signal and if she was detecting anything. The girl responds affirmatively, mentioning that the life signal was growing stronger and that it might not be human, so they should be cautious. At that moment, Seryung responds that they would launch a reconnaissance drone to identify the location. However, Robert, without hesitation, leaves, saying he was going to kill whatever monster was there. Seryung says they would follow him and stay alert. Suddenly, a light appears at the end of the tunnel, and a burst of fire starts erupting from that location. Seryung, visibly confused, finds her face pressed against another girl's. It's revealed that the protagonist had shielded both of them from the attack, coldly observing the situation. The girl, disbelieving, asks what he had done. At that moment, Lee tells them to move quickly. Looking at Robert, the girl asks if he was still alive or if he had died. She asks Sunja to analyze him, questioning if he had really been killed. Sunja responds that he was still alive because the combat armor had done its job, mentioning that Robert hadn't responded because he was still in shock. At that moment, a beam of light appears above the protagonist, which soon takes the shape of a flower. All the light begins to envelop the place, and an unknown person stands before Lee, who is apparently meditating. Seryung asks if that was the strong life signal they had detected. Sunja confirms, supposing that it was probably the leader of Mount Hua, whose name and title was the sovereign of the fluorescent flower sword, Yong-Sik-Sam. Immediately after, Lee picks one of the flowers, noting that the fact they were plum blossoms in bloom meant that the man had reached the pinnacle of the plum blossom celestial fragrance heart technique. However, he still didn't understand why the flowers were purple, which meant that the celestial fragrance technique had merged with the divine art of the purple mist. At that moment, the girl reappears, calling the man father, and mentioning that the situation didn't look good. Immediately after, Seryung asks if something was wrong. Lee responds that even the elders of Mount Hua could only choose one martial art to master. And when the desires of a martial artist surpass their limits, a demon takes root in their heart, and for that reason, that person was no longer human. He asks them to gather the others and flee the area, as the fight ahead would be no easy task. He warns that even he could not guarantee their safety. Suddenly, the girl runs desperately toward her father. Seryung tells her to stop, saying she shouldn't go after him. However, Lee responds that it's too late because the girl had already reached her father and was now embracing him. As a consequence, the light vanishes and her father seems to regain consciousness. Confused, Seryung asks what all of this was. Sunja responds that everything had returned to normal. Additionally, all the people had returned to the city, appearing all at once. Sometime later, the group had left the area, and the girl said that they had told her there was no one around. She asks if the bioscanner was malfunctioning. However, Sunja responds that the scanner was completely normal, but something still didn't feel right, because all the people in that place had their energy completely drained. Then Robert asks if everything wasn't fine, since everyone seemed normal. They had thought that everyone was dead, but since they were okay, everything seemed normal. Immediately after, he raises his hand to place an order at the restaurant. Shortly after, the waitress appears. However, she ends up ignoring Robert. He wonders if that girl was serving someone else, and right after, when the girl returns, Robert tries to place an order again. Once again, he ends up being ignored. Then Sunja responds that it wasn't that she didn't hear him, but that it was as if they couldn't see them. She asserts that no one in the restaurant even looked at them. It was as if they weren't aware that they were there, as if they didn't exist. Seryung, in turn, says that she didn't want to get involved, but she had a bad feeling about this. Meanwhile, the father of the other girls seemed to be drinking tea, and the protagonist thinks he was ignoring the guests who were right in front of him. However, the girl says that her father wasn't a rude person. It's just that he simply couldn't see them. She asserts that he's been like this since he returned from his tour. But the strange thing was that he performed all of his tasks and duties normally. Drinking tea, going on inspections, having meals, and tending to his garden, and always at exactly the same times as before. However, it was still useless because he couldn't see them. But still, they had to be careful not to interfere with his routine. At that moment, the protagonist takes the tea from the man's hand. Immediately after, the girl says that was a bad idea, asking the boy to move out of the way. At that moment, the man draws his sword and attacks the protagonist, who merely dodges the attack. However, the man begins to launch a sequence of attacks at him, and the protagonist easily dodges them all. Tired of it, Lee says that this was dangerous and they should stop. Then the two attacks collide, and as a result, an explosion occurs. Amid the smoke, the man is still standing. Then the boy says that he was really good. The girl asks him to give back the teacup, otherwise her father would become even more enraged. Lee, in turn, mentions that when a person surpasses an unattainable limit, the human body cannot withstand it. And as a result, the body explodes like a balloon and ends up falling apart. For this reason, it must be as if he had reached an impossible realm. Immediately after, above the man, a kind of flower sprouts, which quickly strikes at the protagonist. But he immediately grabs his teacup, throwing it towards the flower. As a result, the attack vanishes. Then the man picks up his teacup. During a full moon night, the girl says that she had returned home after finishing her interstellar tour. But everyone had already been like that, acting as if they were mere clockwork dolls, repeating the same things at the same times. Robert sees a man, who breaks the repetition. The boy asks the man what was happening there, but the man doesn't answer and acts as if he were frozen, leaving Robert confused after noticing that he had stopped moving. But as he looks around, the boy realizes that everything around him was frozen. Then the man Robert had touched completely disappears. The boy, in turn, asks Sunja what had just happened. But with a bored look, the girl responds that she didn't know. Seryong says that if the girl didn't know, no one else would. Sunja then draws her conclusion, saying that judging by the wave pattern of the particle, it resembled teleportation, but on a much larger scale. Immediately after, the group notices that everyone around them had disappeared. The girl says that all the life signals on the planet had vanished. Immediately after, the group realizes that something was approaching. Those things resembled machines, and in a matter of seconds, they were surrounded. Robert asks if they thought this was a dangerous situation. Seryong is surprised by this, saying that they were androids, but she questions why they were in such bad shape. Sunja corrects her, saying they weren't androids but robots. They were models created for simple tasks, but they were old models equipped with low-capacity AI, so their cognitive abilities were limited. Seryong says she was scared for nothing because they were just construction robots. Then she tells Robert not to worry because the robots couldn't harm a human being. However, the boy points out that they were all holding swords. Even so, the girl approaches, telling the machines to step back. However, one of the androids suddenly rushed toward her, but the young woman dodged the attack, wondering why it was doing that and if it was malfunctioning. Then all the androids started advancing toward her. From a distance, a girl observed the situation and said that whenever all the people disappeared, the machines would appear, attacking every living being they saw. Seryong's group flowed from the machines, running across the rooftops. The girl mentioned that when she returned after finishing her tour, she had also been attacked. Looking back, she saw an empty chair and said that if it weren't for her father, she probably wouldn't have survived. And for some reason, the machines never went to that place where her father was. Even though everyone else disappeared, her father remained. As he observed the situation, the protagonist said that the man was holding back, burning all of his internal energy along with his soul, ready to face his inner demons if necessary. And you believe the man wanted to protect something no matter what. While gently touching the girl's head, the young man said it was admirable, so he would take care of it. The girl, in turn, asked where they were going. Lee Mokjin said he wanted to take a look at the face of the scum responsible for all of this. Seryong's group was completely surrounded by androids. The girl asked why the machines were attacking humans. Sunja said it was impossible because the intelligence systems of androids couldn't violate the 3 laws of robotics, and attacking people wasn't even an option for them. Seryong wondered if they were acting that way because they were malfunctioning. Then Robert realized what they were dealing with. The androids began advancing toward the girls. Seryong told Sunja to hold tight and protect herself well. But the androids were hit by gunfire, causing them to explode. Robert appeared wearing a suit of armor and said that those things weren't robots, but rather Iron Ganti, Chinese hopping vampires. The flaming demon Seryong was there, and next to her was the intelligent android named Sunja, and also Robert, a former sergeant from the Special Tactical Division of the Northern Galaxy Combat Unit. The S-Demons gang were a group of bounty hunters who mainly operated around the edges of the galaxy. Furthermore, they weren't a threat, as they could be eliminated in just 10 seconds. Then the other man asked if he had just said that Robert was from the Northern Galaxy Combat Unit and the Special Tactical Unit. Right after, the other man asked if they should issue the order to eliminate that man. However, the young man remained silent. Meanwhile, the protagonist was looking around, wondering what was happening, mentioning that they had been fighting, but everything had already ended. Robert responded that this time he had fought for real because he had been waiting a long time to do it for real, and he had kept the parts of his armor in good condition. He asked Seryong what would have happened today if he had listened to her and sold his equipment as secondhand. However, back then, they were forced to sell those things because they didn't have enough money to buy food. He wondered what could have happened if he hadn't insisted before. Immediately after, Sunja revealed that they hadn't dealt with them because they had left on their own. If they had continued attacking, they wouldn't have survived. Then the protagonist asked if those things were made of metal. The girl revealed that they were robots. However, Lee didn't seem to understand what she was saying. So immediately after, the girl asked Sunja to explain for her as she was too tired to talk. Sunja asked him to think of them as machines that could think and act like a normal person. However, the protagonist responded that no matter how much the world changed, there was no way a piece of mortal material could imitate a human being. But at that moment, he was shocked because the girl immediately removed her head. Desperate, the protagonist asked who she was. Seryong in turn questioned if they still hadn't told the protagonist, and Sunja responded that they were too busy to discuss it. Immediately after, a robot lying on the ground seemed to still be alive. Observing the protagonist, it realized that he wasn't registered in its database. Furthermore, it seemed he wasn't equipped with an internal energy unit, which indicated that he was an immortal and a pure natural. Getting up, the robot said that judging by his foolish actions, he wasn't someone they should be concerned about. However, the other man appeared to be a problem, because as a soldier of the Galactic Combat Tactical Unit, he was probably an elite soldier. Additionally, if he was the first surgeon, it meant he was among the best of the best. A man like that wouldn't have come to a place like this by coincidence without a purpose, and the robot was ordered to investigate Robert and keep an eye on him. Meanwhile, a ship was flying through space and soon arrived in a designated district, entering the atmosphere of that planet. Inside a capsule, an unknown person begins to descend, and the man from earlier thanks him for coming from so far away. The boy says it had been quite a journey, so it better be worth his effort. Meanwhile, the man who had injured the protagonist was still in a wheelchair, with the boy's handprint still on his head. The other man asks if the boy could see anything, to which he responds that he could take a look. Then he asks the man if it still hurt. The boy mentions that the pain had lessened significantly, but his head still felt like it was burning. The boy asks if the burning sensation was still present. The man confirms that the boy had asked about it. At that moment, the boy presses the man's head tightly while examining the wound. The other man comments that it was different, as the first scar was swollen, but the second was more noticeable. The boy then explains that those were the marks of the Novenhim palm, a low-level martial art taught to any novice disciple in his sect. The other man responds that he had mastered that technique at the age of 7. Continuing, the boy says that the essence of the Novenhim palm is cold energy, but instead it left it burn, so the scars naturally looked different. This meant that he had reached the level where he could perfectly suppress the coldness of the palm and leave the burn only through the impact of the strike, indicating that it was an act of consideration not to kill his enemy. The man then asks if that was truly possible. The boy replies that it was possible, but only in theory. However, he didn't want to discuss it further, asking if the man wanted something to eat. Meanwhile, back on the protagonist's ship, Robert was talking about the Iron Ganti. Seryong asks what that was. The boy explains that it was a rumor he had heard when he was still alive, about the development of a new type of combat android that included humans in its kill parameters. Right after, Seryong says that was ridiculous because an android's intelligence circuits were designed based on the 3 laws of robotics, and they couldn't harm humans. However, Sunja explains that to bypass that, they replaced the intelligence circuits with the brains of dead humans. Then the protagonist asks again if she really wasn't human, to which she responds that she could take her arms off if he wanted proof. However, the young man responds that wasn't necessary, affirming that this world was bizarre. He suggests they just eat. While eating, Seryong says that based on the fact they were attacked, it made sense, but it was too absurd to believe, because using human brains was insane. At that moment, the girl looks to the side, noticing that Lee had a frightening expression. She asks him if something was wrong, and asks Sunja to give him a bit more food. But the girl responds that everything had run out. Seryong then says that if that was the case, there was nothing else to do, but they still needed to figure out what was happening, because it seemed like they were in a bad situation. At that moment, the protagonist comments that those beings were very disrespectful. Even though the era of martial etiquette had faded, they still dared to steal. Confused, the girl asks what the protagonist was talking about. Irritated, Lee says that even if they didn't know of his true identity, he had already declared himself a celestial demon. Seryong advises that they deal with this later because they had better things to do. Immediately, Robert says he will go with her. The protagonist responds that he would go as well, but then quickly changes his mind. Meanwhile, Seryong and her group were analyzing the robots from earlier. Robert, in turn, asks what was wrong with those robots. Sunja explains that it was because they were prototypes, not finished products. Meanwhile, Sunja begins to analyze one of the robot parts. Seryong asks if she was trying to figure something out. Sunja responds that their neural networks were very simple, and the intelligence circuit they were equipped with was extremely outdated. It was at a level where it was difficult to even call it artificial intelligence. Furthermore, the chip was optimized to receive commands but had no will of its own. The other girl asks if they were controlled remotely, to which Sunja responds that this was the case for each of the robots. Based on her analysis, the total number of robots that had attacked them was over 9,000. This meant that at least 9,000 humans were controlling those robots. Meanwhile, the man from earlier seemed to be staring at something. Below him were several capsules containing humans. Back at Mount Hua, Suryang asks what the total population of that district was. Sunja responds that it was exactly 9,818, which meant that only one person was left. The scene then cuts again, with the other man asking the boy what he had just said. The boy responds that he had declared a total lockdown for the entire District 32. No one could enter or leave without his permission, and for that reason, they should call the team back immediately. However, the man still didn't understand why he was doing all of this. The boy responds that they were in difficult times, because 2,000 years of peace was a long time and the prestige of the martial alliance formed by the Union had already weakened. He asked the man if he knew what happens when the tiger that rules the mountain loses its fangs. The man responds that the wolves take over, but the boy says he was mistaken, for the wolves would try to become tigers themselves. The boy says that wolves form packs because of the tiger. When the tiger is gone and they look around with the eyes the tiger once had, the other wolves will start to seem weak, because they are much weaker than the tiger, and the first to become a target in a moment like that is the strongest wolf. With the hunting habits they developed when they were in packs, the wolves will unite and then kill him. In the martial world, that is your sect's position, and therefore you must act with extreme caution. Then the man asks if he was saying that an unidentified individual using martial arts from his sect had done that. However, the other guy says he didn't know if that was the biggest problem. He mentions that he received an emergency call shortly before arriving there, and that the unknown individual was heading toward Mount Hua. Upon hearing everything, the guy is very surprised. The other boy says that an unknown element was placed in a barrel of gunpowder ready to explode, and if it were a spark, the whole world would explode. Thus, understanding the situation comes first and actions come afterward. Right after that, the guy leaves the station in his spaceship. And the guy, while deep in thought about everything that had happened. The scene cuts to another place with someone asking if he was saying that the missing people reappear at night. The girl says yes, except for her father who had stayed behind. Suryang, meanwhile, was observing the situation from a distance, asking how long until sunset. Sunja says that on the planet Mount Hua, day and night change every 6 hours. Because of that, in a second, it would change to day. At that moment, Suryang seems to be surprised by something, because that other man was simply hugging his daughter. The girl says that her father did those things without awareness, caressing her head, drinking tea while inspecting the facilities, reading in the garden. Just like when he went on his last presentation tour, he did the same on her birthday last year, and for some reason, repeats it every day when the sun rises. With the others, it's the same thing, as they repeat a specific day every time. Soon after, Robert appears on the call saying that no one was showing up, and even so, the streets remain empty. Suryang asks Sunja the reason for all of it, and the girl replies that instead of appearing, they are gradually disappearing. Hearing the explanation, Suryang seems confused, but when she looks at herself, she realizes something, because her body was simply disappearing, and within seconds, it had already disappeared completely, leaving Sunja alone in that place. Right after, the scene cuts to another spaceship. A guy, meanwhile, was analyzing a planet. Then someone appears saying that a teleportation had been detected from the center of Mount Hua's planet a short time ago, mentioning that the analysis confirms it is the flame demon named Suryang. The leader asks what the destination was, and the subordinate says it was the second moon of Mount Hua's planet called Genta. Thus, the scene cuts to that specific moon. Inside one of the craters, someone seems to be screaming, asking what was happening and why their body was disappearing. Then the shape of their body begins to emerge amidst the light. Suryang, desperate, wonders if by any chance she had been killed, because that shouldn't happen, and there was still a lot to be done. Moments later, the girl realizes that her body was no longer transparent, wondering what had happened at that moment. The girl then starts to analyze her surroundings, coming across an unknown person who was in front of her. Suryang wonders who that guy was. Besides that, he had a very peculiar appearance. The scene cuts back to the previous spaceship, with the guy saying that the teleportation seems a bit unusual, mentioning that there are no traces of consent from the entity in motion during the teleportation process. Therefore, it may be a forced and unauthorized teleportation, which is forbidden by galactic law. This is a very serious issue and should be better reported to the superiors. The guy then asks if there is anyone more powerful than him in that place. Without delay, the subordinate bows, saying no and that he was the only authority. Thus, the man asks to continue monitoring for now. And if they are using technologies forbidden by galactic law on that moon, it means is significant support possibly from a great authority. Therefore, he must not intervene recklessly, making sure to investigate thoroughly before taking any action. After hearing all of that, the subordinate simply accepts everything, and that guy was still analyzing that moon. The scene then cuts to another location with the girl asking what had just been said. And who did she really meet on Mount Hua? The girl responds that the person was saying he was her father, clearly stating that he was the one who had been her progenitor. Besides that, in the fight she had against him, she ended up losing. Surprised, her mother wonders if the one who defeated her daughter and claimed to be her father could be that person, who was on Mount Hua at that very moment. Soon after, the scene cuts to another location with Robert saying they must save the captain, because some scumbag dared to kidnap her. Lee, confused, asks what Robert was saying now. Sunja responds that it's just curse words and she really doesn't want to translate what he said. The other girl says that the place where Suryeong was taken might have to do with the incidents on the planet, and maybe the others were taken to the same place. But it was obvious that they had no proof of that. Sunja says the phenomenon that happened with those people is the same as what happened with Suryeong, and it was a forced teleportation without the consent of the one being transported. Robert says it means they are trapped somewhere and therefore shouldn't stay idle. They need to rescue them quickly. The protagonist, confused, asks what was wrong with Robert. Sunja says that apparently the guy has post-traumatic stress disorder due to his time in the military, struggling to control his anger when he gets stressed. After hearing all of that, the protagonist says they should go right away. But Sunja says it's no use because once the guy starts, he doesn't listen to anyone. And surprisingly, Robert agrees, apologizing for what he had done. Sunja says that if the captain was subjected to a forced teleportation, there's a limit to the distance she can be moved. Technically, long-distance teleportation is impossible, so interplanetary teleportation is out of the question. Therefore, Suryeong is probably within the planet Hua or one of the two other stars. Then Lee asks where she could be. Sunja says the planet Hua still has no signs of life except for the Sword Sovereign, who could be ruled out. The only thing left would be the two moons, which are called Genta and Ciceros. Although there are signs of life on both, it's hard to pinpoint an exact location because the moon is very close. Observing the situation, Lee asks if they're going to have to guess. The girl then becomes thoughtful, saying that the captain is obsessed with gold, so she would choose the golden planet called Ciceros. But little did they expect that it was the wrong planet, because the correct one is the second moon called Genta. The scene cuts to inside that planet with a man observing Suryeong, who then asked who he was. Scans start appearing about Suryeong as she was a 1.4 giga internal energy unit mounted externally. In addition, the only external weapon is the sword tied to her waist. Then the man becomes thoughtful about the scans the robot had given, saying that she's a bounty hunter from a remote place who hides something she can't even use. Again, Suryeong asks who the man was. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location and a plant was growing in the darkness. An old man, meanwhile, was analyzing that plant. Then a little boy appears at the location, saying that he needed to discuss a matter. The old man asks if it's related to the events on the planet of Mount Hua, mentioning that the boy was entrusted with resolving it, asking him not to act impulsively and to wait until the sprout blooms completely. Only then will he know if there's a poplar or a willow, because they must wait until the entities supporting them are fully exposed, and only then can they act decisively. Even so, there was the servant wondering if he hadn't matured enough. But if there was another reason, he wanted to know why that had brought out his immaturity. Then the boy says that during his investigation into the matter, someone unexpected appeared, executing martial arts and reached the level of energy flow reversal. Not only that, but he also knows a secret technique from their sect called the Sur and Demon Heart Sword Technique, doing all of this with complete mastery. One of the problems is that the person is not affiliated with their sect. But without wasting time, the man asks for that person to be killed, because he is an anomaly and even a monster, asking that when he is found, he should be killed without any mercy. After hearing all that, the boy is surprised. The scene then cuts to the present with the young man atop the spaceship, apparently heading to another location. Once again, the scene cuts to Suryeong asking who that guy was. Right after, the other man asks to scan her. And at that very moment, another robot appears behind Suryeong. Using ability, the girl asks what he thinks he's doing. But within seconds, that robot disappears again, reappearing once more behind the girl, grabbing her by the cheek. Surprised, Suryeong wonders how the creature was so fast. Moments later, the man tells her to just accept it because resistance is useless. Besides, he will ask a few questions and she must answer correctly for him to grant her a life free of suffering. However, Suryeong hadn't given up, telling the guy to just shut up. Observing the girl's abilities, the man is surprised, realizing that she had adaptive variation. Moments later, Suryeong grabs a weapon from her waist, starting to spin it around her body. Then the robot charges at her once again. The man says it's useless because the robot contains data on all the martial arts in the world. Amidst the situation, Suryeong thinks the guy was right, because the robot is reading all her movements. Even so, she didn't give up and kept attacking the monster, who easily dodges one of her attacks, landing a strike from behind Suryeong, which causes her to be thrown far away. After this battle, a monster had apparently already won. Still, the girl remains standing, and the other guy, meanwhile, was just watching the battle. In the middle of that situation, Suryeong thinks that none of it is going to work. At that moment, the robot disappears once again, reappearing behind the girl, where it was about to grab her again. Surprisingly, Suryeong ends up disappearing, because she had simply leaped. The robot, realizing the girl's movement, does the same. Suryeong quickly throws her weapon, aiming it at the robot, but he easily manages to block the attack, about to grab Suryeong once again. Then a light appears, and that weapon had apparently stuck to the other robot's arm, where right after it stretches again, piercing through a part of that creature. At that very moment, the other old man's cup ends up shattering, and the guy thinks that it's the dagger of the Black Sky Blood Dragon from the Tang clan of Sikwon. Then the robot collapses to pieces on the ground. After this battle, Suryeong is finally the victor. Moments later, the guy asks who the girl was. Meanwhile, she's thinking that this is troublesome. The guy says that the Tang clan of Sichuan was exterminated 10 years ago, asking how she knows their martial arts. Right after, the girl begins to invoke an ability, saying they had already reached that point, mentioning that desperate times call for desperate measures. Thus, the girl activates all her stats to the maximum. Observing the girl, the man realizes that she still had many more extinct abilities. Irritated, Seryong tells the guy to shut his mouth. Looking up, the old man says that she was mastering the sky to attack from all directions. Then several attacks are launched toward that guy, who meanwhile is just analyzing the abilities, saying it's the infinite rainflower technique. At that very moment, an explosion occurs. The scene then cuts to a flying ship. The other girl says that the circumstances in which she met that person were also very strange. She had arrived at Mount Hua to respond to a call, but momentarily lost consciousness, and when she woke up, she was in front of him. Furthermore, she still hadn't understood the reason, which was about the one-sided teleportation. The guy says there's no need to be surprised because he brought her there to fulfill her desire. The girl was confused about everything the man had said. The man asks if she doesn't want to become stronger and didn't want to see the world under her feet. That's why, even after earning the infamous title of fighting Ghost, he even turned his spaceship into a dueling arena. However, the closer he got to his goal, the further it seemed, leading him to cry every night in despair. The girl thinks that back then, the guy seemed to know a lot about her. Besides being annoying, he was extremely unpleasant. After that, they had no choice but to fight, but no matter what she did, everything was useless against that person. The scene cuts to the past again, with the man saying he would make her strong just like him, all because she was his daughter. In the present scene, the man asks Seryong to answer his question. If she did, he would make her body even more powerful, all at the cost of abandoning her useless mind. The scene cuts once more to the other girl, and her daughter says that she had received something from that person. That was simply that power. Her mother is surprised, realizing that it was the steel fortification ability. Moments later, Sunja was analyzing some data. Robert asks why they are still standing still. Right after, Sunja seems to have found something on her radar, and in front of them, an unknown ship was there. Annoyed, Robert asks what that was, telling her to say for it to move away, because if not, they'll go right through it. However, Sunja replies that she can't, and Robert asks why. Sunja says it may look small, but it's a Celestial-class warship. Besides, it belongs to the Celestial Demon sect. Robert, hearing all that, is surprised. Thus, time passes, and that other boy was already inside Sunja's ship. Not only that, but he was observing the protagonist, who meanwhile was eating calmly. The boy had apparently recognized Lee. Robert asks what brings someone from the Celestial Demon sect to that place. The boy says he is a first-class officer of the Central Committee of the Security Network. Right after, the boy sits at the table, telling Lee to feel comfortable speaking with him. Robert, hearing what the guy had said, thinks that means he's a high-ranking officer from the Celestial Demon sect. Moments later, the boy says he has an urgent request and came to talk to him, asking them not to get involved in this matter, because the mastermind behind this incident is someone called Ritual, mentioning that he was once a top-tier scientist, leading the development of military weapons for a government defense company, a project whose name was Steel City. But due to the inhumane development process, he was expelled, and after that, he disappeared. At that moment, he was hiding somewhere nearby, conducting experiments on a much larger scale. In other words, he wasn't exactly expelled and is actually receiving even more resources in secret. That's why they suspect his supporters are some factions within the human government's armed forces. However, Lee didn't seem to be listening to that entire conversation and changing the subject, tells Sunja that he needs water. The boy, surprised, thinks that even after hearing all that information, he still didn't show any reaction, wondering who that person really was. Then Robert says that means this was the work of the human government's military. The boy says this is beyond what civilians can handle, and they should not get involved. Robert says that if that's the case, he wants to know what's going to happen to their captain who was kidnapped. However, the guy says there's nothing that can be done about it, and the only thing to do is pray for her. Hearing all of that, Robert becomes very frustrated, saying that if they try to stop them, it doesn't matter who it is, they'll push through by force. But he says he doesn't want to interfere with them, but also won't do what they're ordering. Besides, he wants to know why he's giving such valuable information to them, which means he wants to use them as tools and get rid of the responsibility. And a boy who doesn't have a single hair on his head is trying to manipulate them. Hearing all of this, the boy asks if he can know who Lee is, who asks if that's the real reason he came there. However, the boy remains silent. So Lee gets up, saying that if that's the case, he doesn't need to know because they have nothing to do with each other. Right after, the boy questions whether he has any connection with the Celestial Demon sect. Lee, in turn, responds that he has none. The boy says he'll believe him for now, so all of his actions from this point on have nothing to do with his sect. Lee, accepting everything, says he understands and tells the boy to leave because they are busy. And after that, the guy leaves in his spaceship. Lee was watching the ship leave, thinking it's a relief that there are still talents in the Celestial Demon sect. Even so, that boy is still very immature. Without wasting time, Robert says they should go right away. Sunja says it's true, but the coordinates have changed. Instead of Cicero's, which was their assigned destination, it would now go to the moon Genta. The scene then cuts to that specific moon. Inside that place, someone seemed to be getting dragged. Then it's revealed that it was Sirion who was there, and a robot was apparently taking her to a different location. Next, Sirion regains consciousness, asking what the guy was trying to do. The man says he couldn't believe she was already awake, and that it seemed like something special was in her noble bloodlines. Sirion questions where she was and what the guy was planning to do with her. But the man asks her not to worry because he was going to free her from all pain, erasing your memories even from the darkest parts of your past, turning you into an Iron Ganti, giving you a simple and useful life where you would know nothing but obedience. Sirion, trying to move, realizes she was completely paralyzed. The man says he had blocked all the meridians in her body, paralyzing her entire nervous system. At opening a few hatches, he says she won't be able to move. All she can do is stay still and wait like a good pet. But when he looks at what happened, the man is surprised, because Sirion had simply stood up, telling him not to have foolish dreams because he may be able to kill people from the Tang clan and from Sikwon, but he will never be able to dominate them. Then a light begins to emerge in that place, apparently coming from Sirion's hand, saying it is called pigeon blood poison, and people born in the Tang clan receive a grain of immortal poison in their hearts as a gift, all to be used before death. Ritual, meanwhile, was trying to resist the poison. Sirion says it's useless, and the more her heart burns, the stronger the poison becomes, enough to melt anything. Right after, the girl calls Ritual an ugly monster, saying they should die there together. At the same moment, something seems to have happened, and one of those other robots appears in the area, hitting Sirion's arm. When she realizes it had already been detached, and so the local alarm starts to sound, reporting that an intruder had been detected. Moments later, the scene cuts to our hero, and beside him was Robert. Several creatures seem to be coming at them, and it's revealed they are several of those same robots from before. Robert says he'll take care of those things and that Lee can go save his captain. Quickly, the protagonist leaves, heading toward the crater of that moon, managing to pass through all the other robots. At the same moment, a huge explosion occurs. Robert, surprised, just watches. Several robots start fleeing from that explosion, and Robert says that Lee should at least have helped him a little before leaving, because now all the monsters were coming after him. Without wasting time, Robert begins using all of his weapons to defend himself. The scene then cuts to Ritual, who was observing the entire battle. Robert, not giving up, shoots at all the robots, using every weapon he could at that moment. Then a gigantic explosion occurs again. Robert, in turn, activates his anti-gravity rocket. After that, he jumps. The robot, analyzing Robert, says that all of his equipment is certainly from Special Forces. However, all the gear is outdated and no longer in use. Ritual says that Guy is an active soldier, not retired, and wonders why he's even concerned, ordering to get rid of him along with the others. At the same moment, a noise starts echoing through the place. The robot says that an intruder had entered District 8 and was now about to enter District 7. The man, surprised, wonders what was going on. The robot says that intruder is passing through all districts, so now is unable to analyze the location entry data. Starting to analyze the intruder's location data, it already knew where he was. But surprisingly, an explosion happens, preventing the robot from speaking. The man was just observing, because in front of him, there was a broken wall. And from outside, our hero appears, beginning to observe that mysterious man. Then Lee begins walking toward the man, who was wondering who this person was. Lee calmly walks past the man, approaching where Sirion was, realizing that she was now missing a part of her body. Ritual asks who he was. The protagonist, meanwhile, was analyzing his companion, asking if it was him who did this to a child who had just entered youth. Besides that, he had no respect for people, being nothing more than a mere monster. Ritual, observing the protagonist, seems surprised, because his gaze is very different. Once again, he asks Lee what he was doing, who then raises his hand. Ritual was just watching what he was doing. Then that other metal bar begins to move. Our hero says he refuses to talk to anything that isn't human. Then the metal bar starts to float, passing beside Ritual. After that, Lee grabs that weapon. Surprised, Ritual thinks that Lee was using void manipulation. Besides that, the guy clearly doesn't have an internal energy unit installed, wondering how Lee can use void manipulation, which can only be performed by those who have reached a transcendent level. Supposing he's probably using ancient martial arts. Even so, it's bad because the boy appeared at the worst possible moment, and if at least he hadn't been injured by that crazy woman, he might have had some chance. Right after, Lee points his weapon at the man's head, saying that he's not a human, much less a warrior, questioning how he can think about useless things in the middle of a fight. Moments later, Ritual charges at the protagonist, telling him to shut up. But Lee, in a matter of seconds, had disappeared. When he appears behind Ritual, he had already landed an attack. As a result, Ritual's robotic arm had already been detached. Lee says that with that, he's already repaid what the man did to the child. Now all that's left is to pay the price for making him angry. Moreover, he should prepare himself because the price of angering him will be very high. At the same moment, the protagonist's aura begins to surround the entire area. In the midst of that situation, Ritual thinks he's been very unlucky, because not only did he have to deal with a woman from the Tang clan of Sichuan, but now he has to face that person. With the previous injury, the operational rate of his internal energy unit was below 40%, He concludes that he has no chance of winning now. In that case, he must activate all his energy to the maximum. The system then issues a danger alert because the operational limits were exceeded and it's unable to control the heat output. Lee says the ability is very strange, wondering how the world ended up like this. Right after, a voice tells him to kill that person. Lee then looks back, realizing it was Sirion, who says the man is going to self-destruct to kill everyone. At the same moment, a light begins to surround the man, and an explosion happens. Moments later, the scene cuts to Robert, with his cannons completely depleted. Moreover, some of the equipment was already malfunctioning and would be impossible to use. The other robots were advancing toward Robert, who says that if Lee had helped him just a little, he could have resolved everything perfectly, asking all the robots to stop because they should take a short break, asking if by any chance they didn't know who he was. Then Robert removes all his equipment, saying he is the general surgeon of the Special Tactical Unit of the Northern Galaxy Combat Forces. Even so, they shouldn't be afraid and should all come at him at once. At the same moment, an explosion occurs in that place. Robert, confused, asks what is happening, and a beam of light appears on the horizon, covering the entire moon. Robert, meanwhile, just watches, and another explosion happens. Someone seemed to be watching the moon from a ship. Seeing everything, the man seems surprised. His subordinate says they detected a gigantic-scale electromagnetic field explosion on the moon of the planet Mount Hua. An explosion of that magnitude can only be caused by the military, and he believed the human government is involved in this issue. However, the man says that in all the records, including footage, he had never seen anything like this. Moments later, the scene cuts to another spaceship. It is revealed to be the boy from earlier who was watching the entire explosion. The scene returns to Robert, who, seeing all those robots lying on the ground, wonders what was happening. Even so, he didn't have time to think about that because he still needed to find his captain. At the same moment, another beam of light appears. Behind him, the protagonist appears together with Sirion, who was simply in the arms of the protagonist. Meanwhile, he was just observing the girl. Thus, time passes and the planet Mount Hua had returned to normal. The people who were used as test subjects in the experiment also returned to their daily lives. Fortunately, they don't remember anything, as if it never happened. So the old man says it sounds like a mysterious ghost story, asking how the guy could have done that. Then the boy says the only explanation is that they were working with entropy reversal. The old man asks him to explain it in simpler terms, because not everyone was a genius like him. The boy says it's a technology that reconfigures time itself like a loop, and due to the risk of creating multiverses, even experiments were banned. However, he not only completed this technology, but managed to reverse all the subjects used in the experiment at once. He also created forbidden technologies such as unilateral teleportation, and because of that, that guy is nothing less than a genius. The old man says that with abilities that great military factions from the human government must be willing to support him. Changing the subject, he asks if the boy by any chance was already dead. However, the boy says he's not sure. The old man says that if that were the case, it means the guy is still alive. The boy in turn agrees. Then the old man asks him to make sure to get rid of him properly. He also must not forget about the person who is using the martial arts of their sect. Hearing all these instructions, the boy simply accepts. Moments later, the scene cuts to him on top of a spaceship, and the boys seem to be apprehensive about something. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Mount Hua. A person says that his daughter told him what had happened, so he doesn't know how to thank him for saving his family from those rebels. But the protagonist replies that they are not rebels and are more like puppets. A flashback appears in Lee's mind saying that there were more people behind that incident and a child had told him. The man then says that it's true, saying that even if the Mount Hua clan has weakened, it's still impossible for anyone to dare act against the planet's greatest faction. Observing the situation, the protagonist says it seemed like he would close his eyes as if nothing had happened. The man, surprised, wonders how Lai could see through him, because even though he was still young, he was staying calm while they were talking about this incident, wondering who this person really is. The old man says the most important thing is to ensure the survival of the 10,000 members of the clan, and he doesn't care if he has to throw away his pride. Besides that, Lai doesn't seem nervous while speaking to him. Everyone always treats him with respect, but at that moment, his attitude seems normal. Lai says he doesn't need to think about that because it was his own decision to live looking at the world from above. Hearing what the boy had said, the man wonders if that means he considers himself a supreme being. Right after, he asks Lai if he could know who he really is. Standing up, the protagonist says that if he's going to live with his eyes closed, he should stay that way because opening them will only increase his problems. After all that conversation, Lai leaves the place. Even so, he wants to ask something because he doesn't know much about the world in this era, asking if there is any technology that can reconnect limbs. Lai is aware that it sounds ridiculous, but he has seen many absurd things lately. Thus, time passes and the scene cuts to a spaceship. Sirion, meanwhile, remained unconscious, apparently inside a capsule. Sunja was watching the girl from afar, analyzing some data on her tablet. Moments later, Sunja leaves that place. Wasting no time, Robert asks how the captain is. However, Sunja replies that it's not good at all. Robert asks why and if by any chance it was only her arm that had been detached. Sunja says that her blood is filled with poison that is produced by her own body, and for that reason, there is no antidote. She tried to neutralize the poison as much as possible, but it's only spreading further through her internal organs. Desperate, Robert says they have to go to the Grand Hospital, asking why they haven't left already. Sunja says again that there is no antidote, and if they want to go to the Grand Hospital, they would have to go to Kina and Nebula, mentioning that Seryong probably won't survive until then. Robert, desperate, asks what they should do. Sunja says they should prepare to say goodbye because the captain said to put a shield around her and throw her into space after her death. That's why she's going to gather money so they can buy high-quality armor. The scene then cuts to another location, and above Mount Hua, a ship was floating. The other man says that this ship belongs to the matron of the Western Sky Sword, mentioning that they tried to make contact several times but received no reply. The man says that it seems like she didn't come there to see him and therefore should be left alone. But the other man says that this is their sect's territory, and even if she is the matriarch, her behavior is disrespectful. Even so, the leader asks for calm because the Mount Hua sect is currently in a process of reconstruction and growth. Because of that, patience is the greatest strength of their sect at this moment, and they must endure at least until the Mount Hua sect is strong enough to strike back. Right after, the leader leaves that place. Moments later, the scene cuts to the floating ship. The girl says she came to seek an audience with the revered master to discuss a matter, but it seems she might offer unexpected help, because it preferred she could help the girl who was with him. Leah asks if she means she could reattach her arm, and that the world really has changed a lot if that's true. The girl says that it's very easy, and the hardest part is removing the blood poison in her heart that had spread throughout her body. Hearing all that, Lee asks if the girl is from the Tang clan of Sichuan, because it's no surprise that she has such an explosive temper. The girl says it seems he has impressive knowledge, since blood poison is a secret technique of that clan. The protagonist, surprised, asks if she really knew all of that. Changing the subject, he asks her to help, and since she received his request, she should feel free to state her conditions, asking what she wanted from him. Right after, the girl says there's someone she needs to meet, and she'd like Lai to open a path to him. Our hero says her voice was full of killing intent, and it seemed like she was very angry. For some reason, he feels that the person she's talking about is someone he met before, because not long ago he met someone who made him want to beat him to death. But if that person is her target, then she's already late, because the guy was already killed. But surprisingly, the girl says that guy is still alive. The only problem is that he ended up hiding in a place much deeper, where she would need Lei's help. Moments later, the scene cuts to a robot disposal site. Meanwhile, someone was approaching a capsule, apparently with some pieces of clothing in hand. At that moment, something begins to scan the surroundings. An unknown liquid starts leaking from the capsule, which soon after opens completely. An unknown person was inside it. The girl approaching the man congratulates him on returning to life. Then it's revealed that it was that same old man from before. Rachel asks who she was. She replies that her name is Rachel and that she is a vessel of his. Besides that, he should just wait a little until all his memories return. The man, confused, begins to observe the girl, who thinks that Rachel will love her again. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location. The other girl says that place is where the military discards their robots, and that's why the man must be hiding there. The problem is that it's operated by the human government and under the surveillance of their planetary defenses. Lee asks if this so-called human government is similar to an official body, because a child had mentioned the same thing once. The girl says that it's a term that hasn't been heard for thousands of years, and Lee really knows how to spark people's curiosity. Anyway, the human government is an official entity that has a distant, but not hostile, relationship with the martial arts world. Lee asks if that means they don't get too close but also don't stay too far, stating that the elite's habit of maintaining power hasn't changed. Observing the protagonist, the girl thinks that Lee talks as if he were thousands of years old, wondering who he really is. Changing the subject, our hero asks what she wants him to do. She asks the protagonist to divert the attention of the planetary defense forces. The scene cuts to a man observing the explosion, saying he just received a report saying the lab was completely destroyed. It's revealed that Ritual was at that location, saying that they encountered an unexpected problem. So he erased all the evidence, and maintaining the secrecy of that project is his top priority. The man says it seems like his tongue wasn't injured and he can still talk plenty, asking if he'll still stay calm in front of the project's investors, because if they find out he destroyed it, he doubts their lives will be enough to calm their anger. Ritual says the project didn't completely fail, as the Steel City project is just part of the process. They gathered enough data through that procedure and therefore it can be considered a successful project. Because of that, they should proceed with the main project, whose name is Iron Ganti. When Ritual starts to leave the room, the man calls him again, asking if he could make something like the one that was beside him. Hearing all that, Ritual remains silent. The man says he's been stuck in the middle of nowhere for a long time and is getting bored, mentioning that if it's difficult to make a new one, he should at least lend it for a few days. About to leave, Ritual says he'll consider the proposal. The other man says that Ritual is treating something that isn't even human as if it were a person, and for that, he is insolent. Moments later, the scene cuts to another place. Seryong, for her part, had already awakened. In the midst of the rain, the girl remains silent, wondering why those memories were so dark. The other girl said she seemed like someone with a frivolous attitude, and it turned out she had been hiding behind a mask all this time. Reaching out her hand to Seryong, the girl told her to hurry up. But Seryong didn't want to do it, saying she needed to protect the transport portal. The other girl said it was an illusion because there was nothing left to protect. She claimed Seryong had lost everything, and that was why she was stuck in that illusion. Even so, Seryong refused to accept it, insisting she had to protect the portal even if it cost her life. Having no other choice, the other girl struck Seryong with an attack, saying that if she persisted, she would have to drag her back by force. The scene cuts to another location with Seryong waking up. Meanwhile, she was still inside that capsule. In front of her, that same girl from before was using some equipment, apparently using a device to recharge her body. Changing the subject, she asked how Seryong was feeling, mentioning that her reattached arm would feel uncomfortable for a while and that she should focus on recovering until her neural network stabilized. Seryong then thanked her for saving her life, saying she would definitely repay the debt. However, the girl with yellow hair said she was overestimating herself because debts are shared among people of equal standing. No matter her relationship with the Tang family and the one from Sichuan, it was insignificant even compared to her peers. Besides that, there was no reason to spend all her internal energy to save her. Seryong then asked why she saved her, but the girl said she wasn't qualified to ask that question, mentioning that to place poison in someone's heart, the Tang family and the one from Sichuan were truly cruel, as she barely managed to remove it. The rumors were true. They said it was the deadliest poison. Then, surprisingly, Seryong asked to have it back, saying it was her soul. At that moment, the system notified that the internal energy unit was fully recharged. The girl said that she had already activated the poison and chosen death, which meant she had abandoned the poison. Because of that, it no longer belonged to her. Hearing all this, Seryong remained silent. The girl said she had become hers, but now she would return it to her. In exchange, she had to tell her everything she knew about that man named Lai. Hearing this, Seryong was surprised. Moments later, the scene cuts to the protagonist. The man said the reason he wanted to meet the venerable master again was to repay his kindness. Our hero asked him to forget it, as he did it willingly, and a cup of tea was more than enough. The man said he understood, but the roles of debtor and creditor were different, and besides, the Mount Hua sect wasn't used to having debts. That's why he would repay it with sincere advice, asking him not to approach the matron of the Western Sky Sword, because she was a venomous spider living in a deep, dark abyss. Moments later, the scene cuts to Seryong. Looking to the side, she noticed that other girl who thought she infected everything around her with darkness. The one with yellow hair told her not to feel relieved for surviving because she would die by her hands. Seryong asked why and whether she had some kind of debt to settle because she didn't remember anything. Then the girl said it was because her mother had saved her. An awkward silence filled the air after that. As Seryong began to walk away, she said the two of them were very alike. Irritated, the girl told her not to ignore her because she would definitely be killed by her hands. Seryong said it did make a difference. Even so, she wanted to know something, asking why she kept speaking informally to her and questioned how old she was. Then the scene cuts back to the protagonist, thanking him for the advice but saying he had to handle it his own way. The man said he didn't know what request she had made, but her true intention was probably something else, that she was surely after someone important to her, mentioning there was a legend that any man who encountered the throne of the Sky Sword would never escape her clutches, all because of the ideals she pursued. Even after everything, he had met that woman in his youth. She was beautiful and radiant, breathtaking even. Though he was already engaged at the time, it was hard to refuse her marriage proposal. Even now, sometimes he still regretted rejecting her. Furthermore, there were rumors that more than 100 men had succumbed to her. All of them gave her their genes. Even so, later she saw the ones who had been abandoned. Because of that, she has another nickname, Black Widow, devouring her partner completely after mating. Hearing all of that, Lee says she probably has made children. The man says it's probably more than 100, as many as the seeds she had collected. Lee asks if that's even possible and wants to know how old she is. But the man says that's not the point, because she uses gene cultivation to grow them in test tubes, being able to make 100 at once. Surprised, Lee says it seems the world really has become strange, asking why she wants so many children, since raising them isn't an easy task. The leader says she's searching for a perfect being, pursuing a dream she was never able to fulfill. Even with all she did, she was never able to create a copy that satisfied her. It was then that the man warned him, so Lee must be careful, being seen by her is extremely dangerous. Then the protagonist gets up, saying it's a pity. The man asks what the problem is. Lee says it would have been nice if she were his type because maybe he'd have liked to have his own child. Moments later, the scene cuts to Seryong. Robert happily says he knew she would survive and believe from the beginning. Seryong asks if he could let go because he was making her uncomfortable, but Robert says they're comrades and he was just worried about her. Meanwhile, the protagonist was eating. Seryong says she heard he was the one who saved her. Even so, she wants to ask just one question, questioning if Lee is older than her. Hearing that, our hero remains silent. Seryong says that not denying it is the same as confirming it, and that Lee could even be old enough to be her grandfather. Taking the plate away, she asks Lee not to eat that anymore because it's bad for his health, asking Sunja to bring healthy organic food instead of instant meals. Right after, the protagonist asks her to give it back, that is, if she doesn't want to die. Moments later, the scene cuts to another place. An old man asks what she had just said. The girl says she found out who Li was because about 2,000 years ago, there was a man who voluntarily sealed himself in a stone chamber in the star system. His name was Li Mok Jin, and that's extremely similar to the secret of the celestial demon sect. But the old man says that wasn't what he asked, questioning what Li said afterward. Then the girl says that Li refers to himself as the supreme celestial demon, leaving the man very surprised by what he had just heard. The scene then cuts to another location. Ritual, meanwhile, was observing a device. A countdown begins for the charge to reach 100%. After that, the data input reaches 100%, and an unknown chip had apparently been designed. Rachel says both the data input and output are stable. Rachel asks how much energy it had. Rachel says the maximum charge is 8.5 cycles, and if the object exceeds its limit, it will enter self-destruction mode. Hearing all of that, the man says that's great, asking it to come to its master. At that moment, the chip starts moving, heading toward Rachel's hand. Soon after, the chip had apparently come to life. Moments later, the scene cuts to a soldier serving coffee. Another guy asks what that was. Meanwhile, someone was holding one of those chips. Ritual says this is the product he requested, and its name is the Iron Ganti project. The old man says it's a project that can transform living human bodies into enhanced combat androids. They should be indistinguishable even when mixed among ordinary people and have the ability to freely use superhuman martial arts. But no matter how much he looks at it, that thing doesn't look human. However, Ritual says it definitely will happen. Then the chip jumps, charging at the other soldier beside him, beginning to enter his body. Desperate, the soldier tries to fight back. However, it was already too late. The old man, surprised, stands up to observe what was happening, and the soldier was apparently transforming. Ritual says it's a parasitic android specially designed to enter the human body, paralyze brain nerves, and take control of the system, which basically turns infected humans into living androids. Not only that, but it also releases internal energy up to 8.5 cycles, making the infected person become a martial arts master. Along with that, it is equipped with data on the most effective martial arts techniques in the world. It could be said that the Ganti project is a killing machine. Observing the soldier, the old man asks why the guy was in that condition, because he simply no longer looked like a soldier. Ritual says it happens because the genes are different from the experimental samples. Thus, the immune system resisted, causing his body to become deformed. Right after, the chip exits the man's body, and at that moment, he collapses unconscious on the ground. The leader then begins to examine the chip. Next, Ritual asks them to prepare for the next day. Since the prototype is complete, they needed to show it to the investors so they would stop complaining. The old man asks what kind of nonsense that was, as he had waited 10 years, and they wanted him to tell investors that the 500 million investment resulted in a monster like that. However, Ritual says it's because that thing hasn't met its true master yet and would only function properly when it does, ordering the chip to go to its true master. And in that instant, the chip charges toward the old man, but it ends up passing by him, breaking the glass behind them. As he begins to leave, Ritual asks to inform the investors that they will launch the improved prototype the next day. The scene cuts to the planet's orbit, and something appears to be flying. It's revealed to be the chip, apparently heading to an unknown location. Li, meanwhile, was inside his spaceship, and through the window, he was observing something. Moments later, the protagonist group had arrived on a planet. Siriong, surprised, begins to analyze the place. Sunja says that if they get any closer, they'll be invading the security line, asking for the captain's orders. Robert says that place is managed by the human government, and if they do anything, they'll all become fugitives. Next, Siriong asks what happened to the matron of the Western Sky Sword. Sunja says they detected her ship's signal in the Western Sky. 4,000 come away on the other side of the moon, basically. And Siriong says she's probably in a completely safe zone. Even so, they should prepare the landing capsule, leaving only her there if things go wrong. They should pretend not to know her. Right after, the girl approaches the protagonist, saying they had already arrived at that place. And from there on, only the two of them would go. But Lee asks why she's joining them, as she should stay behind too. But Siriong says she needs to go because someone has to control the landing capsule. Robert says she doesn't even know how to pilot a ship properly. Siriong says it's not just that, because she also has a score to settle with that bastard. The protagonist asks her to stay because she still has a debt to repay. That debt is part of the past, and if she keeps clinging to the past, she'll never move forward. The more she holds on to the past, the farther away the present becomes. Hearing all this, Siriong is surprised. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location. The old man says that according to the report, the Iron Ganti project prototype had been completed. They are planning to present it the next day, and it seems like there's a chance of failure according to headquarters assessment. Because of that, headquarters will thoroughly examine the finished product and then make the presentation. Even so, that eye doesn't accept it, saying the demonstration must happen the next day. The old man insists that the report might indicate failure. The eye says the project has already failed like a Mount Hua. It had been a failure from the beginning. Even now, the committee is investigating the incident, and they'd be in trouble if it were discovered that they used Mount Hua as test subjects. They need to resolve it quickly, regardless of the success or failure of that project. That's why they must remember that no more problems will be tolerated. Then the eye disappears. Frustrated, the old man sits in his chair, saying he should never have that lie with that monster. At that moment, an alarm sounds, informing that an intruder has been detected within the border limits. Moments later, the scene cuts to the surface of that planet. An unknown capsule seems to have landed. Then it's revealed that the protagonist was at the site. The scene cuts again with the system saying that an emergency alert was detected in the android disposal area, and that other girl was just observing the planet's surface. Again, the scene changes with the girl asking what that was, why there was something unknown in that plant, saying she had never seen an insect like that before, asking where it could have come from. At that moment, the creature leaves. The scene returns to Ritual, who is meanwhile observing the protagonist on a screen. The other old man was also doing the same. The system says that he is a pure natural. No internal unit was installed and no weapon had been detected. Judging by the fact that it wasn't registered in the database, it could be an unregistered vagrant in a remote area. The old man asks if it's a countryside beggar who wandered in by accident, and that's why he was so unlucky. Even so, crossing the military border is unacceptable. A robot appears before the protagonist. Without wasting time, it charges at him. Right after, Ritual appears in the room, saying that Lee isn't someone the old man could handle easily, ordering the emergency alert to be changed immediately, deploying all defensive weapons they had. The old man in disbelief says he's just a natural, asking why all the fuss. Watching the battle on the computer, that robot was charging at him, which in a matter of seconds is pulverized, leaving the old man shocked by what he had witnessed. Ritual begins to observe the protection field, asking for an analysis of the martial arts technique just used and, if necessary, to connect to the main data center of the central government. The old man asks what he was doing as he was the only one with command and Ritual was trying to challenge his authority. However, Ritual asks if that's relevant because if the project fails, he won't be safe anymore. They must stop that person, no matter what happens, and if the guy wants to cling to his unearned power, he should at least do his job as a guardian. Right after, Ritual leaves the room. At the same moment, the system reports that the intruder has reached the second line of defense, and cannons, beam lasers, and a battalion of guard droids are already ready for deployment. The old man watching the screen stays silent, then orders to erase that guy at once. The scene cuts to Ritual asking for it to be brought quickly, as they needed to speed up the project. The scene cuts again to another location, with the girl apparently on the moon of Mount Hua. An unknown person was approaching her. It's revealed to be that idol from before. The girl says that person has already arrived, and so she'll take her inside. Moments later, the scene cuts to the protagonist, and a tornado was apparently heading in his direction. The boy calmly observes the situation, saying he wasn't even surprised anymore by what happened. In the middle of that tornado, a kind of sculpture emerges. Lee asks if he can know what it is, but without wasting time, the hand charges at Lee, delivering an attack on the protagonist. The impact was so strong it shook the surroundings. The old man, meanwhile, was watching the battle, asking what was going on. Besides that, Ritual was making a fuss over something very trivial. Thinking Lee had been killed, he asks for the body to be recovered and identified afterward. The system reports that the detected signal was abnormal. Annoyed, the old man asks how someone crushed by that creature could still be alive, and the signal shouldn't be normal. Once again, the scene cuts to that hand. At that moment, it receives an attack, which was so strong that even the clouds moved, and from above, our hero appears. Without wasting time, the old man orders to kill Lee immediately. That statue once again tries to strike. Lee says the true energy of that statue is achieved through emptiness, questioning how it could have been filled with such impure violence. Therefore, it's nothing more than a fake using the image of Buddha. Lee begins to observe that hand in front of him. At that moment, a beam of light appears. As a result, the Buddha's hand is easily shattered. Still, Lee wasn't finished. Charging once more toward the Buddha, the protagonist easily pierces through it. The old man in his office was watching it all, very surprised by what he saw, since the Buddha had been defeated easily. Lee says it doesn't matter how fake it is because he made a hole in Buddha's head, so he's definitely not going to Nirvana. Anyway, he doesn't think this level of commotion is enough for her to infiltrate. Then several robots appear again at the scene. Ritual, meanwhile, was observing the system screen, which reports that a martial arts technique had been detected. Its name is the Advanced Sword Technique of Demon Heart Star of the Celestial Demon Sect. Surprised, Ritual asks to connect with Commander Bernard. A phone call begins to happen. Ritual asks what's going on, because establishing the connection was necessary. But someone says he won't be able to communicate with anyone for a certain period. Ritual, surprised, seems to recognize the voice. It's revealed to be that girl the protagonist had made a deal with earlier, whose apparent goal was to meet with Ritual. Right after, Ritual calls that girl Yeonwo, but she asks him not to say her name so casually because it sounds like they've already shared a deep connection. Ritual, confused, asks if she doesn't remember him, but Yeonwo stays silent. Ritual says it's because his appearance changed and he lost half of his face in a lab accident, and on top of that, his height and build have grown since then. Even so, 25 years ago, she came to his laboratory in Galactic City. At that moment, a flashback appears of that man in his younger version. Looking to the side, it's clear someone had arrived at his lab, asking if he could know who she was. The girl says he's even more handsome than the rumors say, a scientist with the greatest talent in history who also has good looks. Because of that, she wants to have a child with him, and a child combined with her genes would be the most perfect in the world, and his seed is necessary for it all. Moments later, the scene cuts to the present, with Rachel watching the girl who still remains silent. Rachel asks if she really doesn't remember him. Right after, the girl draws a sword, saying he forced that memory to resurface, making things even more uncomfortable. The scene returns to that old man again. The system reports that 73% of the perimeter forces have been lost and defense is impossible. The old man, in disbelief, didn't know what was about to come. At that very moment, an explosion occurs in that place. Next to him, our hero appears. The old man asks who the hell he is. He replies that his name is Lee, and since it was written in his report that if there was any problem, it should be brought to him. Changing the subject, he asks where that monster was. The scene cuts back to Rachel asking if she wasn't just a failure, not worth remembering. Even so, that's wrong because it didn't fail and he finally created something. He knows her desire and that insane will to become the perfect and absolute being. That's why he isn't a failure, and she's the only one who ended up losing. Even so, she ended up throwing away her entire life and even placed her heart into finally making it happen. Still, she doesn't even remember him. But at that moment, she strikes with an attack, saying she does remember, but it makes her uncomfortable because he used to talk too much back then. Then a door opens and the protagonist appears in that place, apparently observing something. And in front of him, Rachel was unconscious. The protagonist says it was a clean strike because it really pierced his heart without a trace of hesitation. No matter how insignificant the relationship might have been because there was truly no mercy shown. But Rachel asks him not to speak so recklessly because she simply doesn't know his value. Even so, she will see and soon she will remember him forever as someone who is valuable. Lee says she should forget everything because he is already dead and forgetting is the greatest gift of death. But the man says Lee is wrong, mentioning that he's not going to die and the creation of his life will represent him and eternally prove his worth. Right after, two girls appear in that place and Lee in turn recognizes one of them. It was the child he had seen before. Even so, she seemed different than usual. Right after, the protagonist approaches her asking why she is in that place. Then a light begins to envelop the area. The system starts giving an alert because 91% of the barrier has been lost and 86% of the engine has been lost and repairs are impossible. Even so, the escape ship is ready and they must proceed with evacuation quickly. But the old man says he should never escape and asks if he's being told to become a fool who can't even protect a piece of metal. A voice says it was him who ordered the escape ship to be prepared, and then the old man seems to recognize the voice. And a girl says it's a small symbol of consideration for the old days, but if he wishes to find a glorious end worthy of a soldier, he could do something else, simply by staying in place. After all, that wouldn't be a bad ending either. The scene then cuts to the outside of the spaceship, and below it, the protagonist's ship was also there. His three companions were watching everything from afar. Suryong asks what that was and when that ship appeared. Sunja says that 1 second ago it had teleported there. But Robert says that's not the problem, asking the captain to look at the insignia, because it belonged to one of the largest organizations in the world, which was the human government. Moments later, the scene cuts to the protagonist. Surprised by what he was seeing, and that girl looked completely different from before as a blinding light enveloped her entire body. Rachel asks if he was seeing that because all of it is his. Lee asks what the man had done to the girl, who says that this is for true value. Even so, that level of power is only the beginning, and that child is an empty vessel capable of containing anything and absorbing everything. All of it until reaching the peak of its power. Right after, the girl asks him to stay still because she needed treatment before anything else. But the man says he's already dying, asking if she already knew that. At that moment, he would grant her free will, and because of that, she should live however she wishes. Soon after, Rachel ends up being killed, but there was still something to be done first because he would give the child to her as well. She should make use of that power by following the will of her heart, and those were the last words of her master. Hearing all that, the girl remains silent, observing the tiny heart that was in front of her. Right after, Lee says he didn't know what she was trying to do, but she should stop, because a life of madness is more than enough. Regardless of the story behind it, it should simply be ignored. Besides that, she should return that child to its original state, and that would be his final warning. But the girl says he didn't live a life of madness, he simply lived desperately and fiercely. Even so, he shouldn't worry because his life, Lee, is over, and since he gave her free will, then she'll live however she wants, a life she always wished she could have had. Right after, she approaches the other girl, saying that she will grant her freedom as well. Even so, she will have only one order, because she must do something if they meet again, asking her to hug her tightly just like she did before. After that, the idol girl finally returned to normal, and immediately after, she collapsed unconscious on the ground. Lee, meanwhile, watched everything in silence. The scene cuts to another location with the system saying that a Leviathan-class battle cruiser has been detected. Furthermore, it belongs to the inspection department of the human government. The old man, surprised, begins to observe the spaceship, assuming it's probably going to be an orbital bombardment. Sunja says it's a disaster because with a ship of that size, it's probably part of the regular army. Desperate, Robert says they're doomed. Suryong asks why he's not moving, since maybe they haven't been seen, assuming it's the same as an elephant not being able to see a mouse at its feet. But Sunja says elephants have good eyesight, and they had already been seen before. At that moment, an unknown person enters the spaceship. It's revealed to be the woman who had spoken with the old man, saying that this must be Suryong, the last descendant of the Tang family of Sichuan. Hearing that, Suryong is surprised, but the woman asks her not to be afraid because she'll pretend she didn't see her, mentioning that she even deleted her from the report she received on the way. Even so, the case of the Tang family is under the jurisdiction of the Martial Exchange Department, so they'll pretend they never saw each other. Right after, the woman begins to make an emergency report to the committee, saying that due to an unknown bug, the quantum plant overheated, resulting in the shutdown of the control center and massive violence from the droids. Additionally, recovery or control actions are considered impossible, mentioning that based on the field assessment, she's recommending the 6-art operation plan. Suryong asks what's going on and if chaos is happening down there. But Sunja says everything is under control and all the droids have been deactivated. Then Suryong asks why the woman is doing all this. Right after, a voice says that according to the plan, the use of localized orbital bombardment was authorized following emergency protocol regulations. Hearing that, Robert is shocked by the mention of orbital bombardment. Then the woman thanks them for everything. After all, she says it was resolved without any complications, unfortunately. And as she had heard, she would now carry it out. At that moment, a beam of light is fired from the spaceship, targeting that moon. After that, it strikes its orbit. An unknown object appears there, beginning to drill into that place, entering inside the moon. The other girl says the report will have only 3 lines, and as she knew, bureaucrats really hate writing long reports. She asks what Suryong is doing, saying she should hurry and run, and with that ship, she needs to cover half a light year in 5 minutes. Even so, she hopes they won't meet again because she hates complicated situations. At that very moment, the girl disappears from that place. Suryong wonders what that woman was talking about. Robert says she's about to initiate an orbital bombardment and that she's truly insane. Suryong, confused, asks what that means. Robert says it's a weapon capable of destroying moons or entire planets, and he had heard rumors but didn't believe it really existed. Suryong asks if it's really capable of destroying a planet with that. And Sunja says it's true, because what they fired is now piercing the moon's core. If it explodes there, the entire moon will disappear. Even so, only 3 minutes remain and they needed to escape immediately. The group observing the situation remains silent. Right after, Robert calls for his captain. The scene shifts to another location, with the system reporting that it has reached the core. The girl, watching the situation, smiles. The system reports that it will detonate. At that very moment, the surface of the moon begins to tremble. The ground starts to break apart. The system reports that the estimated time until the explosion is 2 minutes and 7 seconds. The other girl says to prepare for the shockwave, stating that reducing it to 80% would be much more exciting. Right after, that ship begins leaving the moon's orbit. The girl says that this is a true escape, and she knew the guy would be sharp like that. Even so, she wonders why the others haven't fled because staying to watch will get them vaporized. Right after, that spaceship starts moving. The girl, confused, is just watching as the spaceship heads straight toward the moon. Suryong, meanwhile, was piloting the spaceship. Robert says they're all going to die and that way they can't save him. But Suryong says she's going to live at least until 80 and her fate line is super long. Sunja says that according to the system, she'll live a long and healthy life with no problems up to 5,000 years of age. During all that conversation, the spaceship was flying through the debris of the moon. Sunja says the core explosion has begun and the atmospheric temperature is rising rapidly. Robert says they're already doomed and are now going to be destroyed. Looking at the system screen, Sunja says a survival signal has been detected. The atmospheric temperature was at 700 degrees. At that very moment, the protagonist appears at that place, still alive amid all the heat. In the middle of that situation, our hero says it's bizarre because the heat and chaos resemble the depths of hell. Then a monster appears in front of the protagonist who asks if he was finally approaching death and regrets that it came at this moment because if it had come earlier, he would have happily entered its mouth. However, today was not a good day for that because he had promised to protect the child at any cost. But at that moment, Suryong appears at the scene, telling him to board now. The scene shifts to another location, with the system reporting that the ambient temperature is 1,500 degrees and the explosion will happen soon. The girl says there's no use because once the core fully detonates, the temperature will rise to over 6,000 degrees and no god could survive. Even so, it will be great because she won't have to write any report. The scene then shifts back to the spaceship, with the hatch open for the protagonist to enter. Sunja asks what he's doing because the pressurized door needs to be opened. Meanwhile, the protagonist is holding the girl in his arms inside the ship. Sunja says she can't open it because the internal temperature is over 2,000 degrees and they'll be killed either way. With all that, the explosion will happen in just 1 second. And so the moon completely shatters. The group, meanwhile, watches all that light and moments later, nothing remains of the moon. The protagonist still holds the girl in his arms. An unknown person appears at that place. Lee, in turn, looks upward and a man, meanwhile, was observing him. Lee says it's been a long time, mentioning that he didn't expect to see him again. The man says they were destined to meet even if it took over 2,000 years. The scene once again cuts to another location. The man asks to go ahead and ask his question. It's revealed that it was that same man from earlier. The boy questions how he can be so sure that he has a question. But the man says if he didn't have one, he wouldn't have searched for him there at the edge of the living world. Hearing all that, the boy stays silent. The other man says he is tired, mentioning that he walks over countless corpses, and now even his knees and legs feel cold. Confused, the sword-wielding boy asks if he knew him. However, the man says no. Even without knowing, it's possible to see things. The man apparently begins to have a vision, speaking of something that happened even before he learned to walk. In that flashback, the baby was apparently trying to grab the apple. But at that very moment, it shatters, because someone had stepped on it. That person was standing in front of him, and in their shadow, the word demon was written. The baby, unaware of anything, tries to grab the knife, and the man says he was deprived of the right to choose life. After that, the baby takes his knife. The man says he lived forcing himself to feed on death instead of meals. The boy, because of that, ended up growing up and still kept fighting, never being able to satisfy his hunger. After that vision, the scene cuts back to the present, with the man saying that man had lost his reason for existence. But the sword-wielding boy says he is very powerful. The monk says he knew because in terms of strength, there's no higher place to ascend. The sword-wielding boy says that even now he could kill hundreds of thousands who dared lift their heads before him. The monk says it doesn't matter how many cuts because the hunger only grows. After all, blood was never the right food for someone like him. Hearing all this, the sword-wielding boy stays silent, and the monk says he will answer his question. Because even if he wants to stop that purposeless life, there's no one in that era who can end him, and only his own choice can bring such an end. The sword-wielding boy says that if he's telling him to willingly choose death, then his answer is wrong because life doesn't belong to him. And since life doesn't belong to him, even less could death be his possession. Then the monk falls silent. The sword-wielding boy, getting up, says it seems there was no answer. But surprisingly, the monk asks to be allowed to put him to rest, mentioning that since he chose life or death, they would send him to a place where neither exists. It might be a sleep from which he never wakes, but if luck permits, perhaps a new life might present itself. Hearing everything, the boy stays silent. The scene then cuts to the protagonist in the present, where apparently that vision was his. The monk says his appearance is different from 2,000 years ago, mentioning that the dark shadow on his back has lightened, and there is vitality in his eyes, asking if he found a new choice in life. However, he says it was the opposite, for he simply vanished, mentioning that the demon sect has already freed itself from the carvings of darkness and lives under the sunlight. Even so, even the only purpose of his existence disappeared and his life completely lost its meaning. The monk asks why he's still alive. At that moment, the system warns that more than 4,000 degrees were occurring and the barrier would melt. The monk asks if it's not a good opportunity, since he could simply embrace the heat and end his life, questioning why he clings so desperately to his life. The monk asks why he is holding on so tightly. Lee says it's because of a promise, because he promised to protect that child. However, the monk says it will be useless, because Earth erases everything, including promises, asking if he hasn't experienced the universe, and didn't realize that the moment he encountered it, he was smaller than dust, questioning what meaning a promise has to something like dust. Moreover, he's protecting a child whose name he barely knows. That's why he must let everything go. Even if he fights, he cannot protect her. Lee says he already knew and they would die anyway. Even so, it costs nothing to try until the end. Even if he has to burn entirely until nothing remains, he should at least try. Questioning what importance life and death have. For if death makes someone's life meaningless, then it's just proof that life was lived incorrectly. He had realized it now, because death can never truly end life. Everything, as long as that life can leave behind meaningful memories, even if it's smaller and more insignificant than dust, because life transcends death. The monk says that the boundary between life and death, which was the realm of eternity, has been reached, and a light begins to emerge behind the man. The scene cuts to that spaceship, which was apparently fleeing the orbit of the destroyed planet, and a gigantic light appears around it. That other girl was watching in surprise because the other spaceship managed to escape the explosion. After that, he begins to flee from that place. The other girl continued to observe the light. Sirion, in turn, was doing the same, and in front of her, an unknown person was glowing. His appearance was different because he had gray hair. Moreover, he was holding someone. That person was Lee, but he looked different, and the boy remained silent while he was about to leave the spaceship. Sunja says they had a total loss of the shield and 63% of the outer hull, and all other electronic devices were destroyed. Mentioning that the repair costs would be enormous, she asks Sirion if she had money for all that. Sirion, in turn, remains silent. Then Robert says they had nothing. Soon after, the other girl teleports into the spaceship, asking what they had done there. Right after, she looks back, coming across the protagonist with a different appearance, but she still hadn't recognized Lee, wondering who that person was. The system warns that identity verification records were impossible and the energy drive was not installed. Approaching the protagonist, the girl asks if he was the one who did that and also wants to know what his identity is. Observing the boy, she seems surprised as his eyes are different from others. The girl in turn was paralyzed. The protagonist asks who she was. She begins to give various details, mentioning that her position is administrative officer of the Human Government Inspection Department. Then she starts giving details of her life, even saying she is single. Changing the subject, the protagonist asks if it was her who caused the explosion. She replies that she executed the orbital bombing command but was only following pre-given orders, mentioning that even within the human government, factions are monitoring each other. Hearing all this, the protagonist says he doesn't care and doesn't even want to know about it, stating that because of that explosion, children were harmed and so she must take responsibility by restoring everything to its original state, asking if by any chance she is capable of doing that. The girl quickly replies yes. Thus, time passes and some robots seem to be repairing the spaceship. That girl from earlier was, meanwhile, inside a capsule. Sun just says she had no physical damage and the brainwaves of one of the neural engines seem normal, where she will probably wake up soon. Our hero says it's a relief. The scene cuts to another girl asking who that other person with white hair was. Suryang says she should ask him directly because even she herself didn't know. Anyway, she asks if she is an agent of the 10th Special Security Department since she had never heard of that position. By the way, she wanted to know why the girl had talked way more about her life than necessary. But the girl just asks her to shut her mouth, because if a single word of what she said today leaks to the world, something horrible could happen. Suryang in turn asks what she will do. The girl, meanwhile, was about to say something. At that same moment, she realizes something, because Lee was simply standing behind her. But then he approaches Sirion, beginning to observe the ship that was above them. Moments later, that girl was already in her spaceship observing the protagonist's ship. Amidst that situation, she wonders what had happened. Starting to remember the protagonist, she wonders who that person was. The scene cuts to the spaceship, with Robert saying everything is intact and even the internal components were replaced with the latest models. So everything went completely back to normal. But Suryong, observing the protagonist, says not everything had returned. Lee remains silent. Suryong asks if by any chance he liked that appearance. Lee, in turn, asks how it looked. The girl says she didn't like it much because it looked like an idiot trying to seem cool. Hearing all that, the protagonist says he really didn't like that appearance. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location. Our hero, meanwhile, was cutting his hair. The scene returns to that other spaceship from earlier. An old man, in turn, was silent. A flashback appears in his mind with him asking what the girl had said. She replies that about 2,000 years ago, there was a man who voluntarily sealed himself in an underground stone chamber, whose name is Lee Mok-jin and is definitely related to the celestial demon sect. But the old man says that's not what he asked, questioning what the man had said afterwards. And the girl states that he had become the supreme celestial demon. The scene shifts to the present, with the old man remembering everything that had happened. Then he presses a button, saying that she was requesting permission to share information with headquarters. A voice says that permission was granted and therefore she must provide the information she is looking for. Thus, Itaki asks to verify if there was a person from her sect who voluntarily sealed himself in an underground stone chamber about 2,000 years ago. After that, the system begins to run some analyses, concluding that there was a person whose age was unknown, but his name is Lee Mok-jin. Observing the situation, the old man says is the supreme celestial demon himself. Right after, a warning screen appears all around the place. The old man, in turn, is surprised. Moments later, the scene cuts to Mount Hua planet. The clan leader says he felt very ashamed for not realizing that his own daughter had gone through a terrible situation. An awkward silence fills the place. Changing the subject, the protagonist asks if the child was already safe. The man says they ran a full check just in case, and fortunately, no injuries were found. Most importantly, she didn't even remember what had happened. Moreover, she is currently in the kitchen preparing plum blossom tea, because she always makes it personally to serve the guests. Next, the girl starts observing the tea, noticing that, apparently, something had gone wrong, because the petals were simply disappearing. Right after, she starts spinning around the girl. The scene returns to the man saying that Mount Hua will not pretend that the incident didn't happen, and the benefactor's grace is something that will be cherished and kept only in his heart. However, he will also carry the shame along with it, looking at it every day. Lai says that is not shameful because bowing one's head for the safety of your child is a father's duty. Moreover, for a father of nearly 10,000 children, shame is more of a luxury. Hearing this, the man is surprised. Observing, the protagonist thinks that he is different. Although he felt like a giant, his magnitude is incredible. Then Lai says that when dawn breaks, he will leave, and after that, they should forget each other. Right after, the boy begins to leave that place. Even so, the man bows to the boy. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Sirion, who is looking at herself in the mirror. After that, she begins to observe her arm, which had a prosthetic. Right after, someone opens the room door. It's revealed that it was the protagonist who was there, asking for permission to enter. Suryong asks if that's not a question he should ask before opening the door. However, Lai says that it had opened automatically, asking how to close it. Once again, time passes and the two are on top of the spaceship. Suryong asks why the protagonist came to her room. Leah asks what happened to the Tang clan of Sikwon. Hearing this, Suryong is surprised. saying that they simply fell into complete ruin and everyone was dead except her. Even so, the question is a bit heavy, so she'll end her answer there. Lei, in turn, asks if the girl is seeking revenge, mentioning that it is something useless, but if she wishes, he will help her. Suryong says that's a bit contradictory, asking why help with something useless. And the protagonist says it's because her life has value, leaving Suryong surprised by the answer she heard, asking if she needs to finish her revenge to start her new life. Suryong says she knows he's strong but didn't think they were close enough to share her revenge and she would handle her own matters. However, the protagonist says that in his mind, they were quite close, mentioning that in that new world he was reborn into, they are the only ones he knows. And if that's not enough, he would even search for past connections, even if they're useless. He has a very big debt to the Tang family. In the past, the only name he wanted to preserve in his memory was Tang Shang-Wu, and at that time, even if he didn't accept it, he was the only person who insisted on calling him a friend. He was the young master of the Tang clan of Sichuan, and he owes him a debt. Suryong says that is an old debt, too old to inherit, and because of that, a lot of time has already passed. Lai says that revenge doesn't choose its blade, and revenge uses any means necessary to achieve its goal. And if he can't stop her from being foolish, then at least he should become the blade for her. Hearing all this, Suryong stays silent. Getting up, our hero asks her to think carefully. The girl then says that there is one thing she needs, asking for help to earn a large amount of money. Moments later, the scene cuts to the nebulous Andromeda galaxy, focusing on a planet called Turtle. Suryong says that it's a shady market, where they sell people and all sorts of strange things. Looking around, Lee asks why it's so deserted. Suryong says it's their nature, as the vagabonds on that planet rarely move during the day because they might accidentally make eye contact with someone. Lee asks what would happen if they made eye contact. Suryong says that would lead to conflict, and once eye contact is made, and never avoid it, because showing weakness there means you can't survive. She concludes that they only come out at night when they can pretend not to see each other, even if they make eye contact. Lai, confused, asks why they were there during the day. Suryong says it's because they need to find someone capable of moving during daylight. At that moment, two mysterious people appear behind them. The other girl says she can't believe Suryong came there, asking if she came alone and if she's tired of living. Suryong, approaching her, says the girl really hasn't grown up yet, which makes the girl even more irritated, saying Suryong must be looking to die. Then, Suryong introduces the girl, saying her name is Beck, and although she's small and looks young, she's the same age as her. Not only that, but they're also quite close, and the girl, confused, asks what's going on. Observing the situation, Lai says it doesn't seem to be true. Suryong says Beck is upset over a joke because she borrowed a martial arts manual from her family, which was a precious relic. Lai, in turn, asks what the girl did after borrowing the book. Suryong says she sold it, asking how he thought she got the nickname Devil. Hearing what the girl said, the protagonist is surprised. Baek, in turn, is furious, asking if she really sold it. Suryong asks her to relax, saying she's there to return it and will give something worth dozens of times more than the sword manual. But Baek says not to come with that talk, because her family's manual is a high-level martial arts treasure, questioning how she could get something even more valuable, and if she has it, she should bring it out immediately. And approaching the protagonist, the girl says it's already right in front of her. Lai, confused, asks what Suryong meant. Baek, meanwhile, is confused. Suryong asks if Lai didn't say he would help earn money. Observing the situation, the protagonist is surprised, and an awkward silence starts to echo throughout the place. Moments later, the group is walking in an unknown location. Baek says she's not bringing them there because she trusts Suryong, and it's only to make sure she can kill her. Suryong, talking to Lee, says she's just talking nonsense because in truth, she really likes her. Looking around, Lee asks what that place is. Suryong replies that it's the Triad's headquarters and one of the 4 factions that control the Turtle Planet, and that little girl's father is the leader. Then Lee asks to set that aside, saying he came to help and asks what she really needs him to do. Suryong says it's easy because she just needs a high price. Soon after, the group arrives at the place where the leader is. The man, surprised, says it's absurd because he never expected to see Suryong again, mentioning that no matter how much he liked her, he couldn't go against the Triad's laws because she betrayed the organization and stole its treasure. Baek, with a mischievous look, says she had already said before that Suryong would be killed. Then the girl says she didn't steal it, she just borrowed it, and that's why she was there to return it. But the man says that even if she had done that, it wouldn't be enough because debts generate interest. But Suryong asks him not to worry because the interest is substantial. Baek, frustrated, asks her to stop with the tricks and just offer up her neck because she'll make it quick and painless. Surprisingly, the leader asks her to stop because they should hear Suryong out a little. Hearing this, Baek is surprised, asking if he wants to let the girl escape again and forgive her, saying she would be very disappointed if he really did that. The leader says that no matter how deep the connection, not even that can override the laws if she can't repay. Hearing the conversation, Suryong says that Lee worries too much, asking if he knew of a swordsman from ancient times called the Phantom Sword Demon, because he was active in the same era. But Lee says he doesn't know, and if they were martial artists from the same era, he was probably third-rate. Hearing Lee's argument, Suryong says that was already good enough and asks the boy to show something. Confused, he asks what she wants. Suryong replies that it can be martial arts or anything. Actually, it should be the weakest one, because it needs to match the price. Noticing Lee standing still, Suryong asks what he was waiting for, because he should show the weakest and least impressive martial art he knows. Right after, the protagonist raises his fist, remaining completely still afterward. The leader, in turn, was silently watching. Suryong asks what that was. Lee says it's the ultimate single-move fist technique and the first martial art he mastered when he was 1 year old. But Suryong says that one is too weak and maybe he could show something a bit stronger. However, the protagonist says it's not weak, it's just simple and direct, making it vulnerable defensively, but its offensive power is quite strong. Hearing all this, Suryong asks for a proper demonstration, but Lee says the place is a bit tight. After that, Suryong asks if that's not enough already. Baek, curious, asks what kind of plan they were trying to pull. Soon after, the guy says to try whatever he wanted. Moments later, the leader seems surprised, because a crater simply formed beside him, breaking part of the wall of his altar. Apparently, it was Lee who had done that with just one punch, and everyone watching it was surprised. Lee says he tried to go as light as possible, but it seems his controls slipped since it had been a long time since he trained. Moments later, Suryong is talking privately with that man, who asks how that's possible, and how a human being can live for more than 2,000 years. Suryong says she doesn't know, and even so, it's true, because she found him locked in an underground stone chamber in the Mount Hua star system. Hearing all that, the man thinks it was secluded cultivation, saying that anyway, that's not the important part. Suryong says that, as he saw earlier, his martial arts are incredible, and one could say he's a living library of martial arts. The important part is that he's very close to Suryong and, in a way, can recite some ancient martial arts that could be useful. Right after, the man goes silent. Baek, meanwhile, was just observing. Moments later, the scene cuts to the city. People looking up notice a kind of capsule. A man from afar is walking with a hood. Then someone asks him when the shop opens. The young man, in turn, looks back asking if he was talking to him. The guy says he's the only one around there. The man asks if the boy is provoking him. Calling the guy a kid, the protagonist says not to be afraid, and to think of it like talking to a deceased grandfather and respond comfortably. Hearing that, the guy draws his sword. Swinging it down, he says the kid is asking for a fight. Meanwhile, the protagonist stands still, and the other guy seemed confused. That sword simply appears on the table. Picking it up, Lai says not to worry because he'll return it later and just wants an answer to his question. Even so, the guy hadn't given up, and advancing toward Lai says he was already dead. But something unknown stops the man from attacking, because a green barrier appears. The man had apparently used an ability with his eye, realizing that his bone had broken. At that moment, he lets out a scream. Moments later, the scene cuts to Baek, who was observing the protagonist being served by an unknown man. The guy says he did his best, but it was his first time cooking. Lai says he put in a great effort, and while fixing his bones also unlocks some meridian points, so he should be careful when circulating his energy. Then the other girl approaches the protagonist, calling the boy by his name. But at that moment, Lai spits in the girl's face. Frustrated, the boy asks what kind of food that is because even boiling water tastes better. Looking ahead, he sees Baek and asks why she's there. She replies that her father said to bring the boy. Lai says it's disrespectful to call the Supreme so casually, and if her father requests his presence, he should come to him directly. However, Baek says it was her own mistake because she asked to invite him and accompany him courteously. Hearing all that, Lai stays silent. Getting up, he accepts the invitation and asks the girl to lead the way. Right after, Baek says she has something to say because she heard that he knows all the martial arts of the ancient world. However, the protagonist says that if something doesn't exist, he simply creates it. Baek, curious, asks if by any chance there's a martial art that reopens the growth plates. But our hero replies that there isn't. Moments later, the group was already in another location. Baek asks if he's capable of creating a martial art to reopen her growth plates. However, Lai says that it's not possible because their bodies carry history and martial arts are about training to live out their destiny in all its brilliance. The girl seems surprised. Then Lai says that there is something similar, and even if temporary, there is a martial art called the transformation technique that can change one's appearance and body. Hearing all this, the girl stands in front of the protagonist, saying she really wants to learn it. Lee asks for a reason to teach it to her. Right after, he starts staring. The blushing girl says it makes sense, and looking down, she says she will guide him. Right after, the protagonist asks if she knows how to make some kind of food that's made with meat. Baek, in turn, asks if a hot dog would do. Our hero says that's fine, asking if she could make one. Without wasting time, the girl agrees. Moments later, the scene cuts to another place, and Suryong, together with the other man, is watching the protagonist eat. The other girl, meanwhile, is giving him a massage. Lai, while eating, seems content. Showing the protagonist to her father, Baek says that he is her master. However, the protagonist says that's not it, asking how simply passing on a martial art technique would be considered mentorship. Hearing that, the other two are silent. Soon after, They sit in their chairs. Baek in turn continues to massage Lee's back. The other man, observing the protagonist, wonders if he had been in closed-door cultivation for 2,000 years. And since he had seen it with his own eyes, he couldn't deny it. Changing the subject, the man says he must acknowledge that the martial art he demonstrated is much more powerful than the Phantom Sword Demon's technique. According to Seryong, she heard he was willing to pass on that technique and asks if it's true. But the protagonist says it's nothing special. The man says that if he turns the martial art into a detailed manual, he'll forget the time when Seryong stole and sold the Phantom Sword Demon's secret manual. However, Seryong says that's not fair, because even with high interest added, they would still suffer a huge loss, and he needs to make the deal more attractive. The man asks what she means. Seryong suggests an internal energy drive. Even if it's used, it would suffice. Moreover, she heard rumors that he trades in military-grade internal energy drives, asking if he might have some for them. To be specific, one at the core level would be enough. But the man says that could never be allowed because a core-level drive is a treasure among treasures, and no matter how powerful a martial arts are, that absolutely cannot be accepted. Then the girl extends her hand, saying that there are 5 ancient martial arts, asking if he can easily find around 5 martial arts like the one he showed earlier. But the protagonist says that martial arts are nothing. The man in turn starts thinking about those 5 martial arts. Then Seryong says it will be 10. Hearing all that, the man stays silent, saying that everything must be detailed enough so that anyone can learn it easily, and only then does the product have value. Seryong asks if Lee can do that, and the boy replies that it's easy, ordering someone to bring paper and a brush. Moments later, the other two are analyzing the scroll, where the protagonist had written the martial arts. However, the other guy seems to understand nothing, asking what that was. Seryong, in turn, keeps observing the paper, thinking that somehow it looks like a failure. Thus, time passes, and another elder is analyzing the scripts, even though there were several on that table. Meanwhile, the protagonist is eating, and the other girl is preparing more of her food. Seryong says it seems they aren't even worth the cost of the paper, because they even said they are more like exercises than martial arts. Lee says that martial arts, once perfected, become the same thing, and although the forms differ, it's not about ranking their level. The arts he delivered are all easy to learn, and the final point is the same. Therefore, the martial arts are far superior. Seryong says she knows, but for products, the maker is also important, so just one technique up to the level of the secret technique should be enough. However, the protagonist refuses that, saying that he cannot pass on martial arts that already have separate ownership because that violates the laws of the martial world. Seryong, in turn, tries to insist, but the protagonist denies it again. Standing up, Lee asks the girl to stop cooking, and so she must get ready because he will teach her the reverse body transformation technique. Hearing all this, Baek is surprised. Right after, the protagonist begins to take the girl to another place. And in the middle of that situation, Seryong thinks they were truly doomed. Thus, time passes and that old man is still observing the scroll. Seryong says that, in any case, they are still ancient martial arts. The old man, meanwhile, remains silent. Seryong wonders if that won't be enough. Seryong says she won't forcefully insist on their value because there's fault on both sides anyway. The old man says that these are martial arts that had never been seen or accessed before, a strength one could not witness again in an entire lifetime, asking if Seryong can really persuade Lee to help the Triad Society. Seryong quickly says it's true, because they couldn't even live without each other. But it's obvious that a core-level drive has to go in as a bonus. Right after, the man says he will accept the offer. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location with the old man asking how she knew they had a core-level drive in their possession. Seryong says she also heard it through rumors and honestly didn't believe it, but the rumors became so overwhelming that they had to verify. The man says it was exactly as he feared. Seryong, surprised, wonders if he means they really have a tool like that. The man says it's one of the 3 legendary treasures of the martial world, and yet it's not just a rumor, though no one has seen it in person. The man asks if she knows the reason, and Seryong responds that it's very difficult to make. Not only does it require advanced technology, but also a huge amount of resources that major sects must bet their destiny on. That's because secrets cannot be allowed, and during development it must receive approval from the Central Police Union. The man says she is correct, and developing the weapon secretly would make someone an enemy of the martial world. Seryong asks if the man really does that, but he says it wasn't them, they simply got caught in the situation. Opening a door, the two begin to observe a crater, and the man says that it is in there. Seryong, in turn, remains silent, observing the crater below. A light begins to emanate from that tunnel, so strong it appears above the hole. At that moment, an armor appears and an unknown person was apparently resting. Moments later, the scene cuts to space. Apparently, it is a flashback to last winter because an interstellar escape capsule crashed on Turtle Planet, apparently in the middle of a city. Confused people begin to approach the explosion. That was how the monster appeared, beginning to observe the people below. On that day, everyone who encountered him was killed. Returning to the present, the man says that unfortunately the place where he fell ended up being a neutral zone. All the forces in Turtle City, including their society, suffered losses. Only after hundreds of people were killed did they begin to realize it. That person is an extremely powerful master with whom they cannot possibly compete. The current reason for his immense power is special. It is the internal energy drive he installed. Then Seryong asks why this place. The old man says he doesn't know because a year ago he came there of his own will and settled there. Even so, the fact is that man is like a ticking time bomb. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location with a man apparently meditating. In front of him was the android girl from before, and looking back, she begins to observe the man. The scene cuts to the other old man asking if she's saying she wants the command core because she must go retrieve it herself. Moments later, Seryong was already in another place. An unknown girl passes by her. Seryong calls the girl Bake and asks if she was upset since she didn't even greet her. Then the white-haired girl stops. Surprised, she asks how Seryong knew it was her. Right after, Seryong starts observing the girl, saying that even if she completely changed, somehow she would recognize her. Beck says she changed so much that if they were a little less close, she never would recognize her. Seryong tells her she's right, but it seems like she changed a bit drastically. However, the girl says that it was her body that suddenly grew and her clothes became short. Observing the girl, Seryong says that wasn't the only thing. Beck says that if her growth plates had opened, she would have grown exactly like that. So basically, that is her true self. Observing the situation, Seryong says it makes sense. At the same moment, Beck returns to her normal form. And looking around, she realizes she was also back, stating that she is a beginner, and that's why when she reaches the highest level, it will last even a week. Seryong then congratulates the girl and changing the subject, asks where she was. Moments later, the scene cuts to the protagonist. Seryong says it's very easy because it's just him and the person in that pit stopping the core drive. Lee meanwhile was observing the abyss. Seryong says that if they refuse to give up the drive, they should simply force it out, mentioning that she heard it's an item fused with internal energy rooted for more than 1,000 years. She really doesn't know what it is, but it's probably something similar. Observing the situation, Lee says the energy is threatening and it felt like the internal core energy of a dragon was leaking, mentioning that if swallowed recklessly, his soul could be devoured. That's why Seryong should give up, and if the reason she needs that object is to cultivate internal energy, Lee would rather share his energy with her. Hearing all that, the girl is surprised. Moments later, the scene cuts to the city. Lee asks why it's not acceptable for her, questioning whether not wanting internal energy is her way of saying she wants to gain strength for revenge. But Seryong refuses again, stating she wants to take revenge with her own strength. But the protagonist says that given the situation, that seems a little contradictory. Then Sunja appears, saying that trying to logically interpret her captain causes even her brain to overload. Robert says that when he offered to lend money to Seryong, she refused and ended up stealing it, saying it burdened her conscience less. Seryong says stealing is the same as borrowing and means getting it for free. Changing the subject, Sunja asks the boy to eat because when you stop trying to understand, things strangely make more sense. Hearing all this, Seryong gets frustrated. Right after, Lee accepts, saying that if that's really what she wants, he'll leave it at that. Moments later, the scene cuts to another location, with a man saying that it seems the Celestial Flame sect brought Helena, who is a 2.4-meter tall fighting ghost. The other man says that means they know the stench has spread and are trying to resolve things before the flies gather. For that reason, the rest of the factions will do the same, mobilizing all their connections to bring the highest level masters possible. Right after, the other guy tries to speak, but the leader says that when there's a great fire, the best thing to do is step back and just observe, ordering the lifting of restrictions on the forbidden zone where that monster resides. Time then passes, and the scene cuts to another place. The other guy was apparently picking up a cup. After that, another person grabs it instead, asking why he's staring, mentioning that serving tea as an offering to a highly enlightened monk is an incomparable honor for humble creatures. At the same moment, the other guy lunges at the young man, saying he's dead. But surprisingly, the attack has no effect, leaving the man shocked because his hand simply did nothing, and the man with the straw head was simply motionless. Within seconds, another explosion occurs. People seem to be surprised. The other man says he warned that he should have kept quiet. Without wasting time, people bow, and the man says that upon encountering a living Muda, that is the proper posture to assume, mentioning that he wishes someone could guide him to the Blackwater faction that rules the northern region of Turtle. Hearing this, everyone at the table remains silent. The monk, in turn, asked if by any chance they wish to go to hell. At that moment, the other three raise their hands. Moments later, the scene cuts again to the crater. That same light remained at its bottom. Then the other man from before appears again, starting to approach the crater, coming face to face with the man from the earlier stories. The man in turn uses an ability, beginning to analyze the internal energy of that person, thinking that it's really at a basic level. Advancing toward the man, he asks him to hand over the core, landing a direct hit on the guy's chest. Next, the scene cuts to the protagonist and an explosion happens nearby. Helena, in turn, observes from afar. The other monk was also doing the same, and the beam of light could be seen from all sides of the city. The scene shifts for the man saying the Triad faction lifted all the defenses that were guarding the monster, mentioning that they also issued a stay-at-home order. The other guy says it was a terrible moment, right when the Flame Heaven faction brought the 8-foot fighting ghost, asking if the Triad faction is pulling back its efforts instead, because he can almost hear the schemes of Baek Mu, who was the leader of the Triad faction. The man they were observing was the leader of the southern region of Tortuga, a stubborn and long-lived man named Mogu. His subordinate asks if that meant they decided to withdraw from the central battle, but Mogu says a man does not walk away from a banquet table, and that was just their strategy. His subordinate asks what they should do. Mogu says it's obvious they need to throw a bear into this chaos too, asking if a lion along with a tiger and a bear wouldn't be a perfect combination. His subordinate questions if that wouldn't end up benefiting the Triad faction. Mogu says the world never works with poorly made calculations, and if someone plans to create chaos to take advantage of an opportunity, they should give them even greater chaos. That's why they shouldn't waste time and will begin at dawn. Moments later, the scene cuts to the city. In the middle of it, a giant crater was there. Helena, meanwhile, was observing the crater. Right after, she looks up. Then she jumps. The scene cuts to a building, and on top of it, a person appears to be dead. Helena then shows up at the place, beginning to analyze the other guy who was apparently the master of the Divine Spear, and his name was Dosham. Not only that, he was also from the Piercing Spear faction. Right after, a voice says it was exactly him, and that guy is the kid who was bragging a lot about being from that faction. And that same monk from earlier appears at the scene, saying he was a genius that appears once every 1,000 years and was supposedly first in line to be the next leader of the faction. Even so, he dared to put his spoon on Buddha's table first, so he ended up deserving his death. Changing the subject, Helena asks why the guy is there. He says that originally offering food for ancestral rites was a way to ask Buddha to take good care of their ancestors. Even so, it's a much greater banquet than expected, and he chanted diligently, and finally good fortune arrived. Right after, Helena tells him not to get involved if he doesn't want to die. The monk asks how she dares threaten a Buddha who reached nirvana with life and death and doesn't even know what enlightenment is. Even after hearing that, Helena hadn't given up. But the Buddha asks to wait because they should decide the order first. Because even if he's just a kid, he's not someone to be underestimated, but still was defeated with a single blow. And if they fight first, whoever wins will still be injured. Because even with a healthy body, it's hard to deal with a monster. And if they add injuries to that, they might have a chance to finish it off. They can also simply advance alone, and even if they manage to get the monster's energy core, they'd have to be prepared for the wounds. No matter how ignorant she is in everything she's done, because she's heard that phrase that reaping the fruits of others' efforts is already enough. So they should unite to bring down this monster first. But Helena wasn't interested, saying he should stay out of it if he doesn't want to die. Then the girl descends from the building. A monk watching Helena says she's truly ignorant because she can't even do simple math. Even so, it doesn't matter because she was willingly offering herself as a side dish for the sacrificial table. Moments later, Helena was already in the pit. The girl in turn looks ahead, coming across yet another hole. Without wasting time, the girl goes in, surprised by what she saw, finally encountering the armored guy. But the protagonist was already at that place, and Helena had apparently already recognized him. A flashback appears in her mind with her mother saying she must make sure to remember something, because if she ever faces that person again, she must not even lift her head, and if she fails to obey again, she will cut their blood ties. Then the protagonist says that judging by his stable breathing, it seems that all of his wounds have healed. Even so, it's a good moment because he has some questions that needed someone to answer. Observing the protagonist, Helena was surprised. Lee, in turn, begins to analyze the girl, who wonders what was happening because she couldn't even breathe. Struggling to breathe, Helena asks the boy to go ahead and ask what he wants. Lee says that the energy in that person's body is not concentrated in their danchin, asking if it was by any chance spread throughout the entire body. Then Helena uses an ability to analyze the armored guy, who says it's because the casing of the internal energy driver couldn't withstand it and the capacity ended up melting. The reason may be the lack of a functional system capable of running the central level drive, and that was called possession by an inner demon. But Lee says it's different because if it were demon possession, there would be signs of corrupted desires, but that person doesn't even show a trace of desire. And bringing his hand closer to the guy, he says it's as if he were a blank sheet of paper. Then the girl tells Lee be careful. The protagonist touches the other guy's head. At that very moment, a glow floods the whole place. Helena, in turn, was just watching. Lee was also doing the same, apparently realizing something. Helena thinks that the power of his central level impulse is equivalent to a nuclear explosion, but he was managing to supply the energy using only his body. Moments later, Lee had already removed the helmet from that man, finally revealing his face, which apparently was just a normal person. Lee asked the boy to say who he was, who at that moment regains consciousness. The scene cuts to another location with Baek looking at herself in the mirror, apparently transforming into her other form. A glow appears in that place. The girl finally returns to her more developed form, asking how she looked as that is her true self, a fully adult version of herself, and if, by any chance, he liked that. But when she looks back, there was no one there. The only thing there was an old photo. Baek wonders where he had gone, starting to observe the boy who was in the photo. After that, she begins to cry, because she hoped he would return soon and even transformed like that, but there was no one there to see her. Then the scene cuts to Lee again, still observing the unknown guy. Lee says they say the eyes are the window to the soul, asking why his eyes are so empty. Approaching the protagonist, Helena says that no brainwave activity is being detected, and the unit overload seems to have melted his brain. So he is no longer a living person and only pure instincts remain. However, Lee says that if the instincts are alive, the memories that govern those instincts still exist, which means his life is not over, asking how they can remove the wretched object that took over that child. And the girl says it is lodged deep in the heart and must be ripped out by force. Lee, surprised, asks if that wouldn't kill him, and if by any chance there isn't another way. However, Helena says there is no other choice but to do it. Hearing that, Lee falls silent, and placing his hand on the guy's head, says that there is no way to save him. But if he had any last words, he would listen. The boy, meanwhile, seems to be trying to speak. Lee says he must focus, mentioning that it could be dark and blocked, but even so, he must dig deeper. And the more precious the memory, the deeper it will be buried. Our hero, meanwhile, seems to be suffering some kind of consequence, and Helena realizes that he was transferring the corrupted energy to himself. As a result, Lee's body was consuming everything. Even so, that other boy remained with his cold expression. Soon after, Lee asked the boy if he found it, who still remains silent, but apparently remembered something. A flashback of Bach with the other boy appears, and at that very moment, a butterfly lands on the spot, on top of the boy's head. Moments later, the two are walking through the forest. The scene cuts to Bach observing the butterfly. Then someone grabs the insect. An unknown man appears, saying he had caught it. Hearing everything, Bach remains silent, and starting to walk away, asks to just leave it alone. The boy asks the reason for all that. Bach questions who had asked for his help, as she could have handled everything on her own. The boy, hearing that, is surprised. Even so, he continues to follow Bach, asking why she was upset, because if he had done something wrong, she should say so. Still, Bach remains silent. The boy asks if her feet were hurting and if, by any chance, she wanted him to carry her on his back. The girl then gets very irritated, asking if he thought she was a child. However, the guy says that's not it, because he knew she was an adult and never thought she was a child. Starting to walk away, Bach says not to look for her anymore, because he won't find her until her growth plates open. Hearing everything, the boy remains silent, continuing to watch back. Thus, the scene cuts to the present, and that unknown boy apparently knows Bach, who in turn remains with her hand absorbing all that energy. Even so, the boy still had that cold expression. Right after, he starts looking at his helmet. At the same moment, someone starts laughing. The scene cuts to an old man who had already been defeated. Apparently, it was the boy who had done it. The old man, watching the other young man, says that he was alive. The boy says it's true, but even so, the other knights had already been killed. However, the old man says there was no problem because the enemy was also annihilated. Wasting no time, the other boy goes to help the old man, who asks not to be called commander anymore. After all, the order of knights had been annihilated, so their leader could no longer remain. Even so, he was curious, asking how the boy survived and came out unscathed in such a fierce battle, asking if he had been hiding by any chance. And the boy, without hesitation, responds that he had. The old man says he doesn't understand because in all his years since joining the knights, he had never once hesitated to go into battle, always fighting at the front as if he had 10 lives, asking why he held back that time. At that moment, the old man seems to remember something, asking if it's related to that mission, and if he also wanted that item. The boy says it's essential for someone he knows. Hearing all that, the old man is surprised. Then he calls the boy a fool because the central level unit is beyond his handling capacity and only a few transcendent beings can use it. Even so, the boy says the item is of no use to the commander because he was already high enough. The old man, confused, asks what he means. He responds that he heard the central level unit rearranges all genes, including the nervous system related to growth, and it was an item he desperately needed. Observing the situation, the old man says the boy is certainly determined to do this. For that reason, he has no choice but to stop him, mentioning that he is the 126th successor in the Order of the Star Knights and his name is Skolat, being in charge of delivering that item and killing anyone who interfered with it. Hearing all that, the boy is surprised. Soon after, the old man lunges at him, but is easily struck, and apparently it had been the boy. Moments later, the scene cuts back to the present, with the young man apparently changing form. Lee still remains silent. Then he asks him to control himself because a demon has taken root in his heart, and for that reason, he has to suppress it. The boy soon begins to scream in pain. Helena, in turn, was just silently watching. The scene cuts to outside the city, and from that crater, an immense light could be seen. The light was so strong that it rose above the buildings. The monk, meanwhile, was watching from one of the buildings, wondering what that was. Soon after, the light even curves, and a light of another color appears in that place, apparently red. Beginning to follow that other light, it is revealed that it was Lee asking that person to stop. Meanwhile, the monk was just observing, watching those two lights about to collide. The scene cuts to Seryang's ship. The group, meanwhile, was eating. Robert asks how long it had been since they ate out because he was truly emotional. Sunja asks him to savor it slowly because she sold 2 air filters to be able to buy that food. Seryang asks her not to be so harsh because it's just a taste they enjoy only once a year, wishing Robert a happy birthday. Sunja asks what she means and why she's enjoying someone else's birthday. But the girl says she's not doing that and Robert is eating what he likes. At that very moment, those two lights pass in front of the ship, knocking over the food that was on the plate. Moments later, those two lights fall like a meteor. It is revealed that the boy from before, Lee, appears at the scene in a matter of seconds. The guy, meanwhile, seems to be suffering. Our hero says that it's not too late because he has to fight the demon in his heart that's trying to devour his soul. Without wasting time, that boy charges at the protagonist. He needs to land a hit on him. Lee manages to dodge the attack, but if it had hit, it would have definitely caused problems. Still, the guy didn't give up, charging once again at Lee, who manages to dodge the attack once more. At the same moment, a box seems to begin glowing. That boy from earlier was just watching it. Amidst that situation, the old man asks him to stop, mentioning that he's not blaming him at all, and he understands that there was a greater reason for him to abandon the oath of knighthood and sell his soul to the demon. He always considered him like a son and says he must stop this, abandon the item, and walk away. Because if he tries to use that item, it will devour his soul, and if he tries to keep it, the entire world will hunt him down to take it. The boy says he's aware of that, but even so, he must give it to that person, even if it means selling his soul. So the boy starts to take the item, which, in a matter of seconds, seems to begin taking control of his body. The scene cuts to the present, with the boy charging at Lee, who thinks something must have happened after all. After that, our hero takes a battle stance, and striking the boy, asks him to stop. Thus, an explosion occurs. The scene cuts to Beck, who is apparently surprised by something, because she was able to see that light from afar. Even the massive explosion could be seen from the horizon. The scene then shifts to Helena, trying to reach the location of the battle, looking ahead as she comes across some of the traces of the attacks, and that other boy had already been defeated. Standing before him was our hero, who says that Helena had said the boy's heart was different. Helena says that's exactly right. The protagonist says that means to remove it, they must extract his heart. Then the girl pulls out a device saying that using the unit extraction tool, they can remove it without contamination. So she might be able to do that for him. But our hero says he can't do it because it's an act that involves taking someone's life. Besides, things that are etched into the heart must be done personally. Hearing all that, Helena goes silent. Lee, in turn, starts to approach the boy, saying that it's karma as well, and bringing his hand closer to the boy's heart. He says he should just close his eyes and rest in peace, because instead of taking his life, he will assume his own karma, going to Helena's place. At that very moment, Surion appears at the scene, asking the protagonist to stop. Helena then notices the girl, who, meanwhile, shows a worried expression toward Lee. She asks if, by any chance, she knows the child. Surion, in turn, was hesitant with her words, and in a matter of seconds, Beck appears at the scene. Recognizing the person who was there, Beck begins to approach the boy. Surion says that he is the girl's childhood enemy, and they were always together, but one day he suddenly disappeared. The strangest part is that after he vanished, Beck changed. She used to be distant and cold, but then became someone who smiled a lot. But to her, that smile always seemed like it was just crying. Meanwhile, Beck remains watching the boy, who then asks what he had done, asking him to look at her. She asks if it's because they were apart for so long that he doesn't really know her anymore. The boy, meanwhile, seems to be trying to speak. Beck just asks him to look at her, asking if he still recognizes her. But Helena says it's useless because his brain has completely melted, asking how he could still have any memory. Even so, the boy tries to speak. At that very moment, he lifts his hand, leaving Helena surprised by what she saw. Beck says she knew the boy recognized her, starting to approach the boy's hand, but Surion appears to stop her, saying that his drive is damaged and the contaminated radioactive energy is leaking from his body, but Beck says that even so, he is still her friend. Hearing that, Surion is surprised. Beck continues staring at Surion. Letting go of the girl's hand, Surion says even so, not to do it. Meanwhile, the boy still had his hand raised. Beck in turn was saying goodbye to her friend. Amidst that situation, Helena says they have to stop. However, the protagonist says no, mentioning that some bonds are destined to be everything. Meanwhile, the hands of the two are about to meet. The boy closes his hand, telling her to take a step back. Hearing that, everyone is surprised. At the same moment, a flag appears at the scene. Several flags begin to descend from the sky like meteors. After the sound, a gigantic structure appears. Surion, confused, asks what that was. Observing the situation, Helena realizes it's a barrier. Thus, the protagonist strikes it, destroying the thing completely. But surprisingly, the other boy also disappears, leaving everyone shocked by what they had seen. Moreover, only a single piece of paper remained. Our hero says that is the Shaolin's primordial formation, asking if someone had inherited his martial arts, for it must be a master close to the Transcendence realm. Hearing all that, Helena is surprised, remembering that monk from earlier. Soon after, the scene cuts to the headquarters of the Black Faction. The monk from earlier, meanwhile, was inside a building and two unknown beings were behind him. The monk says that Buddha crossed from hell to get there, asking why they couldn't wait a little longer before heading to hell themselves. Soon after, the monk starts analyzing a person in front of him, who, at that moment, stands up. The monk, pleased, says it seems someone left that person alive in order to repay a debt. Even so, the guy is quite large and his chest should be deep enough to store a good sum. Then the man stands before the monk, recognizing that he is the emperor of the Eastern Sky Fist. The monk, calling the man senior, says it's been a long time since they last saw him. The man asks if the monk knew him, and the monk says he's just an acquaintance, for they merely crossed paths. Nothing worth remembering. Annoyed, the man demands a proper answer, striking the monk. Even so, the monk manages to defend himself. The man asks if that is the Vajra technique, then he must be one of those damned Shullin monks. And by his martial depth, he must be a direct disciple. Mentioning that he vaguely remembers a child who used to serve alongside the great Shullin elder 20 years ago, and so that person was probably him. Then the monk says that he had mentioned having an acquaintance who is neither close nor distant. However, the man says it goes deeper, because if he is a disciple of that person, it gives him a reason to spare his life. Mentioning that the thing behind him appears to be a central level drive, and for that reason, he should leave it behind. The monk remains silent. Then the man asks why he is still standing there instead of running for his life. The monk then raises his hand. The man, confused, asks what he's doing, and the monk questions if he shouldn't settle the account, saying the remaining payment is 85,000 credits. The man is surprised, saying he must be asking to die, asking how he dares threaten a Buddha who has already attained enlightenment through life and death, and because of that, he's starting to worry the monk may have lived too long and gone mad. At that very moment, he strikes the monk, but the monk uses a technique to defend himself. Managing to block the attack, an explosion follows. Then the scene apparently cuts back to the present, with the other man observing the explosion, saying that old fool really raised his little pup the wrong way, and since he himself wished for death, he shouldn't blame him for granting it. About to touch the drive, the monk asks him to take his hands off, because the bill still hasn't been fully settled. Looking back, the man is surprised because the monk was still standing, albeit with some injuries. Observing the monk, the man says he's insane. The monk, still injured, says the remaining payment is 85,000 credits. Mentioning that, according to the rules, since the initial contractor paid the deposit, the contract can be nullified. However, he is now officially recognizing him as the successor contractor. Before finishing his words, the monk gets hit by an attack, and the man tells him to keep talking, saying that if he just pays the rest, he can talk all night long if he wishes. Then the monk seems to begin using a chant. The man says that is a martial arts technique that was banned even in Shaolin because it carries the energy of the unorthodox path. But the man says that martial arts are meant to kill anyway. Even so, it was expected because that martial art didn't work on him since he has an indestructible body. However, the man says that even so, it still hurts and delivers the final blow to the poor monk. The man asks if he still has anything left to say, but the monk continues to remain silent. Even so, he raises his hand. The man, irritated, begins to unleash several blows on the monk. Moments later, the scene cuts to the city. The drivers from before were still inactive. Soon after, some drops of blood seem to have reached them, and they apparently begin to glow. Meanwhile, the other man continues to strike the monk, who had already been dead for quite some time. The man, frustrated, wonders why every person he meets seems so eager to reach nirvana. Soon after, the man looks to the side, and those drivers were already disappearing, turning into nothing more than mere paper. After that, the man grabs the item, saying that even in death, the monk is still using cheap tricks. Starting to ingest the paper, the man says it's useless. And at that very moment, the man begins to disappear as well. Thus, time passes, and a voice says that the man had been killed. It's revealed that the protagonist and his group were at the scene. Styrion, observing the situation, says someone killed the man and then kidnapped the others. Helena says that if someone was capable of putting the monk in that state, it's probably an unbelievably skilled master, assuming it's the Emperor of the Eastern Sky Fist. However, Lai hadn't given up, saying that he's still alive. Sirion, surprised, asks what he means by that. Our hero says that he's gravely injured, but there's still a faint trace of life. Soon after, he speaks to the monk, saying he knows he was conscious and asks where the children were taken. But right after, the man raises his hand again. Then the scene cuts to another place with a boy catching a butterfly, telling Bai that he was the one who did it. Soon after, the girl extends her hand and the boy places the insect in her palm and she begins to observe it. Her friend asks why she has that expression and if she doesn't like butterflies. With tears on her face, Bake says it's not that she doesn't like them, but it's just not fleeing. So Bake says that none of this is real. The boy says she's right, mentioning that his chest isn't burning because it used to feel like a ball of fire. Even so, she shouldn't cry because they should be happy to have reunited again. But Bak doesn't want to accept that because when she wakes up again, she'll have to lose the boy once more. Hearing everything, the boy remains silent and the only thing he can do is apologize. Moments later, Bake was sitting beside him. The boy says he never thought of her as a child because she was always the most mature. Beck says that even so, she's small like a child, asking if he doesn't like that. But he says it's not about being small, mentioning that after traveling the universe for years, he became certain of one thing, because there is only one of her in the universe, and that's all he ever loved. He knows Beck hates being short, but she shouldn't worry because he'll give her a gift. Surprisingly, Beck says she never hated it. At that moment, the girl is surprised, and apparently, something was happening to her friend. Soon after, an unknown person appears, and it's revealed that it was the same man who defeated the monk. With a threatening look, he begins to observe the boy, who immediately stands to protect his friend. The man, observing his opponent's stats, assumes it must be a central level activation. Then the man charges at him. Beck, meanwhile, was trying to stop her friend. An explosion follows, and the scene cuts to the monk, who is still extending his hand, trying to say something about credits. Suryong asks what he was saying. The protagonist says he was talking about losing money, and that they should give it to him because it must be a central level activation. And after taking such a beating, he deserves to be paid. But Sunja asks where they would find that much money, because not even selling their ship would be enough. Or even selling that woman as a bonus, it still wouldn't reach the total credits. Helena asks why she's excluding herself if she actually wants to be killed. Observing the situation, Lee seems to be frustrated, saying that he'll put the money in his account and swear that someday he'll pay it back. Hearing all that, the monk continued to remain silent. Suryong says that his nickname is Greedy Demon, and he didn't even trust his own parents when it came to money. At that moment, the blood from that man begins to flow from his body, forming a kind of circle on the ceiling. A blood seal appears in place, and the group was just watching him. Then the scene returns to Bake, and her friend was still fighting that man. Even so, he wasn't in the best condition. The man says he should have evaluated his opponent before attacking, asking if he really thought having a big sword meant he could cut anything, because he doesn't even have the strength to wield it and still dare to rely on it. Even so, he's not the only one with a central level impulse. Because of that, he's going to extract his to become stronger. Meanwhile, Bak's friend was still alive. At that moment, the girl charges at the man, asking him to leave her friend alone. After the attack, a light begins to emerge, but Bake is easily thrown aside. Still, she pleads for her friend to be spared. Without mercy, the man strikes Bak's friend, who couldn't avoid the attack. He could do nothing but watch. Right after, the boy falls to the ground unconscious. Meanwhile, the man is holding his heart. Then he looks back. Coming face to face with the protagonist group, Suryong begins to look around, noticing the other boy unconscious on the ground. Angrily, Suryong tells the man to step away from him, launching an attack at him. But without wasting time, he uses his fire abilities, easily countering. About to strike Suryong, but at that moment Lee appears, managing to defend the attack effortlessly, leaving the man frustrated with what had just happened. Our hero continued to calmly assess the situation, and the man, observing the protagonist, thinks that's a technique of internal energy transfer. Helena says the man is the Emperor of the Celestial Fist of the East, an unparalleled master known along with her mother as one of the 5 Supreme Masters. Ignoring the whole explanation, Lee continued walking calmly. The man, surprised, begins to analyze Lee's stats, but his identity and everything else were unknown. Even so, the boy doesn't have an internal energy driver installed, so he's just a pure natural. Even so, he can use the internal energy transfer technique, which means he's different. Lee says the man's body is solid as steel, and that's why he mastered the Iron Robe technique. The man, surprised, wonders who the protagonist really is, then asks him directly who he truly is. Our hero says he'd love to reduce him to trash, but unfortunately, he doesn't have a good enough reason according to the rules of the martial world. So they'll leave him a chance, asking him to drop what he's holding and walk away while he can. Without wasting time, the man refuses, asking if Lee is crazy. But at that very moment, he's surprised because he was struck in a matter of seconds. After that, he falls to the ground. Lee tells him not to give a reason to be beaten because that's exactly what he wants. Hearing everything, the man is furious, asking how the protagonist dares to do that. Then begins to summon his flames. Observing the situation, our hero tells him not to. The man, enraged, asks if that isn't exactly what the protagonist wanted. At that moment, he destroys that core, leaving everyone shocked by what they saw. Without wasting time, the man charges at Lee, who, in a matter of seconds, takes a hit. Still, that's not enough for the boy because he continues to strike the man several times until he can finally satisfy his fury. Helena and Suryong continue to watch it all. Moments later, Lee calmly observes the man who had taken a massive beating and falls unconscious to the ground. The scene shifts to Beck, who was holding her friend who still appeared to be unconscious. Lee says they need to take the girl, but Suryong says she'll never move, not even until her last breath, so they'll have to drag her away even by force. Then Lee approaches the boy, asking her to move aside, mentioning that he'll let her say goodbye, and after that, she must step aside. Time passes, and Lee was apparently using something to help the boy. Suryong, watching from afar, asks what the protagonist is doing. Helena says it's impossible because the boy is trying to use Return to Origin on him. Suryong asks what that ability means. Helena says it's the state of becoming one with nature itself, since nature is the origin of everything, even the cycle of life and death. Surprised, the girl says she thought that was only a legend, but that man is really capable of it, wondering who Lee really is. Who, meanwhile, was meditating, thinking that he will channel his origin energy to replace the lifeless bloodstream, asking to borrow his life so that he can glimpse the world once more. Time passes again, and the boy had apparently already regained consciousness. With tears on her face, Bake watches her friend, saying he can ask for anything, and even if it were 1,000 requests, she would do them all. The only thing the boy asks is for Bak not to cry, because she looked much better when she had a smile. Right after, Bake says she will never cry again. As one more request, her friend asks her not to hide her eyes. The girl then removes her eye patch. Helena asks if it won't hurt her eye, but Seryong replies that it will be fine because Buck was just pretending. She didn't want to look weak. The scene shifts to the two friends, and the boy says she's beautiful, just as expected. After that, he kisses her, saying he's going to ask her to forget him one last time. Thus, time passes and they had finally held a proper funeral for the boy. Baek in turn watched her friend's grave. From a distance, Seryong and the protagonist were doing the same. After that, the scene cuts to Seryong's ship. She orders them to hurry and get out of there, all because she wants to leave quickly. Leo was watching the place from afar, apparently deep in thought about something. A flashback appears in the protagonist's mind with Baek asking him to remove her reverse body transformation technique. Even so, Lee tells her to keep it. Baek says she could keep it, but she'll never use it. Lee says that not being able to use something and choosing not to use it are different things, and if she truly didn't want it, she should keep it anyway. Hearing everything, Baek goes silent. The scene cuts to the present with the protagonist watching a planet as they finally exit its orbit. The scene shifts to that woman from before. Apparently, she had defeated several people. Before her stood an unknown man, saying her personality hadn't changed at all because she used her own disciples as sacrifice just to vent her anger, mentioning that those children probably called him there to give her a central level drive as a gift. However, the man says they're not his disciples since he only taught them a few tricks to make them more useful. Yanhwa says that if that's how he sees it, then there's nothing more to say, and either way, she must admit that his reputation as the bearer of the indestructible Vajra body was well deserved. Irritated, the man says if she came there to provoke him, then she's wasting her time because rage only makes him stronger. However, Yanhwa says he's mistaken. After all, she didn't come to mock him. She came to give a warning, because he must stay away from that person who belongs only to her. Starting to walk away, she warns that if he ignores the warning, he won't be as lucky next time. Meanwhile, the man seems to be in a lot of pain. Yanhwa says the world believes his Iron Road technique is truly indestructible, but the Iron Armor technique is actually a martial art that gathers all the body's weak points into a single hidden point, asking why he thinks Lee kept punching his whole body but left his left forearm, his vital point, untouched. That's why he should pass that message on, because if he ignores the warning, she'll strike that point without hesitation. Then the girl leaves the place and the man appears apprehensive. The scene shifts to Seryong's ship. Lee, meanwhile, was eating like a madman. Seryong says the central level drive is damaged and will allow Lee to transfer his internal energy to her. But Lee says it's too late because his energy had been drained to restore the child's soul, and it will take at least 3 years to recover. Hearing that, Seryong is surprised, asking what Lee means, and that now he's also left them with a debt of 85,000 credits. On top of that, that monk is a lunatic obsessed with money, and if they don't pay, he'll chase them forever. Right after, the scene cuts to the infamous monk. A boy says he was including 100,000 prepaid credits from the water faction, asking how much the monk would like to transfer, and the monk orders him to send everything to Master Shaolin. Hearing that, the boy is surprised, asking if he shouldn't at least keep a little for himself. But the monk asks to send it all, because the older and sicker they get, the better the food they should have, thinking that when it's his turn, he can just steal. The scene cuts to a man apparently telling a story about a man named Lee Mok-jin who practiced the martial arts of his sect and ended up isolating himself or proclaiming himself as the celestial demon. For that reason, he would investigate, but it's probably a scheme by an external force trying to destabilize their sect. The other says that secret had been buried even within their sect for 2,000 years and not even the high elders have access to it, asking how an external force could know something that even they had almost forgotten, mentioning that if he really reincarnated, he is the 6th celestial demon named Lee Mok-jin, which means there are 3 celestial demons in the world. Moreover, dealing with just one is already a tremendous headache. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.